In the far west of Middle-earth, beyond the great rivers and shadowed hills, there lies a land of gentle valleys and green fields, where the hills roll like soft waves and the sky is low and quiet. This land is called the Shire, and it is the dwelling place of the Hobbits, who are a quiet, unassuming folk. They till the land, grow tobacco leaf, and mind their own affairs, keeping to the old ways and simple lives of peace. They live in holes in the hills, comfortable and well-furnished, concealed beneath grassy slopes and round doors painted in bright colors. Of the 4 farthings that make up the land, the West Farthing is perhaps the most tranquil, and nestled at its heart is a place called Hobbiton. There, under the slope of the hill, with its green crown of trees and deep-rooted soil, stands one of the most well-kept of all Hobbit holes, Bag End. Its round front door, painted a glossy green and scented with a brass knob, opens into a tunnel lined with paneling and warm carpets. In this place of many rooms, bookshelves, and larders, lives one Bilbo Baggins of the respectable Baggins family, a hobbit of means, content with teacups and full pantries, who keeps no adventures nor tales nor wanderings. His days begin with breakfast and end with supper, and nothing ever disturbs him, until one day, something does. In those days, strange matters had begun to whisper through distant lands, but in the Shire, little was heard. Beyond the borders, the world was growing more restless. Goblins stirred in the mountains, and strange shapes were seen in the deeper trees. But none in Hobbiton paid these things any mind. The Shire had been quiet for generations, untouched by war, unbothered by dragons or distant kings. If there were concerns about the rumors of rising darkness in the east or the movements in Dol Guldur to the south, such tales never passed beyond the Green Dragon Inn's doorway. Yet there remained some who still wandered the old roads. Wanderers and wizards were rarely seen in the Shire, and when they came, they were viewed with suspicion or muttered about in corners. One name in particular had become a hushed and half-forgotten thing, spoken of with both amusement and unease. He was called Gandalf. To some, he was known as a fireworks maker or a teller of stories, to others, as a mischief bringer, whose name was remembered in connection with Tookish disappearances of long ago. And it was this same Gandalf who, one morning in the spring of a year full of quiet skies, came walking up the hill, leaning on a tall staff and cloaked in grey, to knock on the round green door of Bag End. That knock, though small and swift, would be the first stone cast into the still waters of Bilbo Baggins's quiet life. How long Gandalf had wandered the wilds before turning his steps toward Hobbiton is a thing unspoken. He was known by many names in many tongues, Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkan among the dwarfs, and his true nature, Maya, sent from beyond the circles of the world, was hidden beneath robes and riddles. But in Hobbiton, he was simply Gandalf, and it was with a purpose known only to himself that he came now to seek a burglar. For behind the quietness of the Shire and the stillness of the hill, there had long been a story untold, a tale bound by oaths and blood. It was not the Shire Gandalf had come for, but one hobbit within it. Something in Bilbo, something half-heard and long-sleeping, called to older things, a memory of adventure in his blood, quiet but not forgotten. There had once been a time, generations before, when the Tooks had looked beyond the borders, and whispers said some tiny legacy of that wildness might still dwell in Bilbo's heart. And so, at the setting of the sun on a warm, green-scented evening, a wizard and a hobbit met again at a doorway they had stood before many years past. Their words were mild, their exchange simple, but something invisible passed between them, something older than either could name. And though Bilbo did not know it, the ground beneath his feet had already begun to shift. The next morning came as mornings always had in the West Farthing, slow and unbothered, with a soft river mist on the fields and the gentle bleating of sheep beyond the hedgerows. The light touched the round window of Bag End like a whisper, casting gold upon the walls and shelves lined with maps and heirlooms. But this morning was not as before. For Bilbo Baggins, who had long measured his days in breakfast plans and the quiet turnings of the seasons, found himself unsettled, though he knew not why. The visit of the wizard Gandalf was not something easily shaken off, even if the old grey man had spoken only in riddles and made strange remarks about adventures and burglaries. Bilbo had shut his door firmly behind him, locking it with the finality of one who intended no further nonsense. But the wind that came down from the north still carried the faint scent of distant fires, and the earth beneath his feet had not forgotten the knock that marked the end of his quiet life. He told himself it was over, that wizards came and went, and their troubles with them. But even as he sipped his tea and lit his pipe, something unsettled lay just under his skin, like a path long grown over, now stirred by a passing boot. He had no time to dwell further before that same green-painted round door was knocked upon again. The sound was firm, businesslike, and utterly unfamiliar. When he opened it, expecting perhaps the return of the wizard or else no one at all, he found instead a most unexpected figure, a dwarf, full-bearded, armored in travel gear, and carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He bowed stiffly, gave his name as Dwarlin, and, without any proper waiting, stepped inside as if dwelling in hobbit holes were a tradition long practiced by dwarfs. Hardly had Bilbo regained his breath than another knock sounded. This time it was Balin, older and polite in manner, but no less insistent in making himself at home. The long hall of Bag End began to fill, boots left traces of mud, cloaks draped over hooks, pipes borrowed without asking. Then came Keely and Filly, young in their bearded years but swift of step and bright-eyed. And still more followed them. Soon there was Bifur, then Bofa, then Bomber, his steps slow and hands already reaching for food. Oin and Gloin came grumbling over road conditions and suspicious of foreign culinary customs. Dori, Nori, and Ori travelled together, each stranger than the last, carrying scrolls, instruments, and ink-stained fingers, and finally, like a shadow beneath starlight, came Thorin Oakenshield, tall for a dwarf, with eyes dark as an unlit forge and a bearing of kingship bound in silence. He said little as he entered, but where he walked, those around him made room. Thorin did not need to announce himself, his very presence was legacy enough. Bilbo stood in a corner of his own home, bewildered and unmoored. There were dwarfs in his pantry, dwarfs in his sitting room, dwarfs debating over maps on his polished oak table. They spoke in languages half recognized, Khuzdul words mingled with Westron, and filled the air with tales of mountains, gold, fire, and vengeance. And when Gandalf returned at last, stepping in as though everything were proceeding as intended, his only words were to introduce their purpose. A map was laid out, old and faded, with curling corners and ink faded by many seasons. Thorin traced it with a finger calloused by both hammers and kingship. "This is the lonely mountain, Erebor," he said. His voice was heavy with memory, for he had once walked its halls as a prince, before fire drove them out. Once, the dwarfs of Durin's folk had dwelled beneath the great peak, with riches beyond counting, and hammers that rang like thunder on stone. But the dragon came then, Smaug the Terrible, drawn by the lure of gold and the light of gem hoards. He came in fire and ruin, casting down the mountain halls and burying the dwarf's pride beneath ash and stone. Now, after long years in exile, the heir of that lost realm sought to reclaim it. Thorin had wandered, forged, and fought, his hands raised in battle from the blue mountains to the forges of the west. And he sought now to reclaim more than gold, a birthright, an oath, a home. Erebor still stood, though twisted by fire within and ringed by shadow without. Smaug had not flown far in generations. But the dragon yet lived, slumbering atop wealth beyond mortal imagining. To defeat him required more than swords, it needed subtlety and secrecy. It needed a burglar, light of foot and small of frame. A thief, perhaps, unseen by the dragon's gaze. Gandalf had chosen Bilbo Baggins for reasons he would not speak aloud. The wizard's gaze was deep and old, and he hid within him knowledge greater than any scroll. Perhaps he had seen something in the Hobbit that even Bilbo could not. Or perhaps his reasons were older still. That night, amid song and smoke and mugs of sturdy ale, the dwarfs sang of paths beneath stone and halls long buried. The deep voices rose and fell like buried echoes, and the firelight flickered in time with memory. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old. Bilbo stood in silence, the notes wrapping around him like ivy through his bones. Something ancient stirred within him, something unspoken and unnamed. It was not desire, nor pride, nor curiosity alone. It was the rustle of distant leaves, the clang of unseen bells, the whisper of Tookish dreams that had slept too long. He went to bed that night uneasy, dreaming of mountains and fire. The dawn brought no peace. Bilbo awoke late, alone again, as if nothing had happened. The dwarfs and the wizard were gone. His house was clean, save a few wet footprints and scattered crumbs. He stood by the round door, looking out at the lanes of Hobbiton still quiet and undisturbed. The kettle gently steamed. The pantry was full. The sun rose the same as before. And yet he stood there, unmoving. He looked again at the marks on his door, the little rune carved there not by chance, but by design. There had been talk of treasure, yes, but more than gold, there had been talk of home, of honor, of oaths. Bilbo could not name what held him now in that moment, but his steps began forward. He raced into the road without pocket handkerchief or coat, across grass still beaded with morning dew. Behind him, Bag End lay still and silent. Ahead of him stretched the road, long, winding, and wild. Somewhere, beyond hill and river, beyond forest and mountain, stood a hall buried in flame, and a journey waiting to be claimed. Bilbo Baggins, who had never known true fear or battle or poverty, ran with what breath he could muster, a single thought pressing from within like a whisper remembered through generations. He was going on an adventure. By the time Bilbo reached the Greenway Road, his feet were soaked and his breath rasped with effort. The fields that had always seemed vast now fell away behind him, unattended and unfamiliar. Hobbiton disappeared into mist behind a swell of hills. Before him, the dwarfs were already astride stout ponies, talking quickly among themselves, pacing bundles, adjusting straps. Their numbers seemed to fluctuate in the rising sun, a confusion of color and beards, all overshadowed by a singular figure wrapped in deep furs and a hood lined with silver thread. Thorin Oakenshield waited, watching the hobbit draw close. His gaze was sharp, but within it there lay no open malice or jest. In his silence was the weight of many years. Gandalf stood near the front, lighting his pipe with a slow twist of his fingers. When he saw Bilbo, he showed no surprise. "Ah," he said mildly, "just in time. Thought you'd miss breakfast." But the meal was long behind them, and the road was waiting. No blessing or ritual marked their departure. They fell into motion as a caravan does, with hooves and creaking saddles and the muffled jingle of tools in saddlebags. There was no ceremony, no farewell. Only the long miles before their feet and a silence deeper than most could name. The company of Thorin Oakenshield numbered 13 dwarfs and 1 hobbit, with a grey pilgrim riding apart. Each dwarf bore the marks of distant kinships, some from the northern halls of the Iron Hills, others from among the Blue Mountains or the remnants of Erebor's old guard. Their cloaks were travel-worn, their weapons modest but carried with the certainty of those who had used them. They spoke often in low voices, laughing in fragments only they understood. Bilbo, riding his borrowed pony, listened more than he spoke. He had not yet learned their tongues, but he had begun to learn their silence. On the third evening, when the sun had failed to breach the line of clouds and the wind rolled low through the grass from distant hills, Thorin at last called the company to stillness. A small fire was lit on a shallow rise, and they sat upon stones worn smooth by wind and time. From within a tight oilskin tube, the map was unrolled, its surface yellowed and its edges brittle. Thorin laid it between them all, and the fire's light caught the edges of thimble lettering inked with a stern hand long ago. "This," Thorin said, as the fire cracked beneath his voice, "is the gateway to the ruin of my people." The mountain shown on the map bore a sharp outline, a single peak framed by contour lines that echoed ancient dwarven cartography. Below it, valleys wound like veins, and near the southern base was marked in fine runes, the secret entrance. Hidden and known to none but those who had kept the law. It was small, said the writing, barely large enough for a hobbit, and would be invisible from the air or road. The map itself had passed through fire and theft, through the hands of Thorin's forebears, and finally found its way to Gandalf, who now served as its guardian in this journey. But it was not only the map that caught Bilbo's eye. Gandalf withdrew another object from beneath his cloak, a key, blackened with age, with teeth hewn in the pattern of dwarvish design. "Durin's mark," said Balin softly, pointing to the symbol etched in silver along the header of the map. A crescent moon and runes beneath it, near invisible now in the low flame. It was written in moon letters. Moon letters, invisible save under the light of a moon that matched the one under which they were written, had been used by dwarf lawkeepers in ages past. When Gandalf had taken the map to Elrond of Rivendell, the hidden crystal inscription had been revealed under a midsummer moon. There, in fading silver, it was written, "Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole." A silence followed these words, deeper than the night around them. Durin's day was a rare thing, the last moon of autumn shining at the same time as the sun. It would not come again easily. The map was rolled once more and stowed away in its protective case. That parchment, that key, that promise, these had been carried across exiles and exoduses. Not merely for treasure, but for the dignity of kingship. For dwarfs, the reclamation of their homeland was not about gold alone but about memory, which no dragon could truly destroy. That mountain, lost to flame, still stood in Thorin's dreams. And now it stood in the dark between them, far away, but nearer now than before. Bilbo, sitting among warriors and ancient names, did not know if he was there by accident or purpose. But the silence of the mountain called to him, too, though he did not yet know its voice. The following days passed beneath tilting weather and fickle skies. Fields gave way to hills, and hills to rocky paths lined with gorse and blackthorns. The lands through which they passed were unfamiliar even to dwarvish eyes. Though the greenway kept its course in fragments, many side paths had vanished beneath growth and time. Sometimes they encountered ruins, broken farmsteads, crumbled watchtowers, old stones marked with moss-covered glyphs. It was Gloin who first began grumbling about the food. The supplies had been wisely gathered, but experience and common sense rarely align with appetite, especially among dwarfs. Bomba was always hungry. Bofur played his flute until silence demanded otherwise. Bilbo tried at first to keep up with the pace of conversation but found himself lost quickly. Names of distant kings, thanes, and forges meant little to him. He watched instead, as hobbits often do, understanding more in how the dwarfs moved than in what they said. Oin and Dori crafted braids of dried root for kindling. Thorin, always apart, polished the hilt of his sword in solitude. Keely and Philly dared one another to scout further ahead with half-serious grins, always mindful of Thorin's nod or frown. The sky bowed ever wider, the road rolling through country that seemed older with every mile. Gandalf, for his part, would ride for hours in silence. He muttered words not in the common tongue and kept his eyes often to the south, toward lands where mists no longer meant rain. Though he remained among them, there were hours he seemed more shadow than substance, as if listening to something none of them could hear. It was on the 10th night that their camp came upon an ill-favored glen where the grass grew strangely paler. They ate sparingly and set no fires, and when sleep came, it was uneasy. Bilbo dreamed of stone halls and a deep voice echoing his name down a tunnel of endless darkness. He awoke with the sense of being watched, though no noise stirred. Come morning, Gandalf was already awake, crouched by the path, studying markings in the earth with the flat of his hand. When questioned, he said only, "Troll sign," and nothing more. None of the company asked further. Bilbo began to sense, with the hazy fathoming hobbits have, that they were approaching the edges of the world he had known. No hedgerows marked these paths, no milestones set in stone. The trees grew larger here, older, as though no axe had ever struck them nor farmer measured their line. Somewhere to the east, the misty mountains rose beyond sight, and beyond them, Erebor waited among cloud storm and broken legend. Bilbo tightened his cloak as a chill rode up his spine. The weather had not changed, but the road had. It bore the weight of centuries now. And the company marched onward, 13 dwarfs and a hobbit chosen under ancient foresight, toward danger neither they nor their songs could yet name. As the road bent eastward and the grass thinned beneath the burden of hooves and boots, the company drew closer to the edge of familiar lands. Behind them lay the farm walls and green paddocks of Erebor, beyond which stretched the wilder ridges of Orna's forgotten northlands. Trees now grew thicker, wilder, and more ancient, as though belonging to a time before borders. Their roots tangled the road, and their trunks leaned together in silent, wordless counsel. With each mile, the company moved further not only from the Shire, but from the waking world, and deeper into the rhythms of things older than history. The mood among the dwarfs shifted subtly with the change in terrain. Where there had once been jovial songs, short jests, and the comfort of routines, there was now a stillness in their company, broken only by the sound of footfalls and hooves on hardened earth. They were drawing near the edges of memory, to places where stories had been rooted not in song but in sorrow. Bilbo, though untrained in their speech, began to feel the presence of something held in them firmly, carefully, woven into every pause in conversation, every long look shared near the fire. It was the weight of exile. Not one that fades with time, but one that clings to the bones. At night, when firelight stretched long shadows across moss and stone, the stories began. Not told as yarns among friends, but as remembered records, passed down like heirlooms that grow heavier with age. It was Balin who first broke that silence, his voice thoughtful and low, not raised for drama or song but shaped by memory. He spoke of Erebor, the lonely mountain, once a kingdom under the mountain, crowned by stars and firelight, whose halls ran deep and far into the roots of stone. Founded by Thrain I after the loss of Khazad-dûm, Erebor had risen in wealth and stature, seated east of the misty mountains. The waters of the river running course nearby, and trade reached farther than even the Iron Hills. Their halls had been filled with the sound of axes and anvils, and the forges of the Longbeards had turned out works of wonder. Beneath the throne of Thor, the dwarf king who ruled at the height of their power, the Arkenstone had been found, a jewel caught at the heart of the mountain like a frozen star. But with gold, always, came the shadow. Dragons had long coveted the wealth of the dwarfs, drawn not only to coin but to hoards gathered and forgotten beneath the stone. It was in the final years of Thrall's reign that the dragon came. Smaug the Golden, born in the withered heath, brood of the long line of winged fire drakes, descended upon Erebor without warning. Fire swept the mountain slopes. The desolation carved deep into the surrounding lands. Dale, the city of men that had grown in Erebor's shadow, blackened in flame. Thousands perished. Stone cracked under dragon fire. And from the sky fell ruin. The dwarfs fled. Thrall was cast down from his throne, his people scattered across Middle-earth. Few survived the fall, and those who did bore ash within them for all time to come. The dragon took the halls, nested deep in gold, and slept. To the world, Erebor was gone. Thrall wandered east, eventually slaying his mind upon the dark threshold of Moria. There he entered unbidden and was slain by Azog the Defiler, a chieftain of the Orcs. It was the final blow to a broken line. Thorin, his grandson, bore the grief of many generations. Young at the time of the sacking, he had watched kings fall and brothers vanish. With hammer and shield, he fought during the Battle of Azanalbiza beneath the east gate of Moria, a battle soaked in blood and haunted by the voices of the slain. It was there, wielding an oaken branch in the absence of steel, that Thorin earned his name, Oakenshield. But even victory was hollow. Though the orcs were scattered, Moria was not reclaimed. The doors of Khazad-dûm remained locked and haunted. Homeless, the survivors turned westward, to wandering and labor. In the Blue Mountains they settled as best they could, crafting fine jewelry and ironwork, but the longing for Erebor endured. The song of the mountain lived in their dreams, as persistent as breath. Some spoke more of vengeance, others of honor. But in each of them was the echo of halls now silent. Thorin had sworn, silently and aloud, to reclaim the mountain. Not for gold, but for the line of his house, and the memory of Thrall burned in his mind. That vow had shaped every year of exile, every hammerfall in foreign forges, every negotiation with stubborn Iron Hill's lords, and every quiet look westward toward the dragon's lair. Though the company rode small, 13 in number, the bond between them ran thick with kinship and oaths. Balin of noble blood, older than the rest, often served as counsel. Dwalin, his brother, stood nearest Thorin in battle. Gloin, fierce defender of his house, brought with him his brother Oin, skilled in herbs and fire-making. The younger trio, Fili and Kili, sons of Thorin's sister, and thus bound to the line of kings, carried not only blades but the hope of their people's future. The others, craftsmen and warrior alike, had pledged themselves freely to a task that might bring death but also deliverance. Bilbo, surrounded by these oaths born of ruin and grief, began to see the gulf between his presence and theirs. He knew little of exile. The Shire had never burned, no fire drake had rained death upon its hills. No goblin lord had slain his ancestors in cold rage. The pantry at Bag End had always been full. And yet here he was, armed lightly, unsure of his purpose, carried forward by the current of something deeper than intent. Gandalf, noticing his quiet, said little but watched carefully. The wizard's reasons for choosing Bilbo had not been plainly spoken. Even among the dwarfs, it had been a matter of doubt. Thorin had questioned it more than once, never with open dispute but with short remarks and distant glances. Still, the wizard's presence and certainty held them in place. Gandalf, more than they knew, understood what lay ahead. He knew the words spoken in the east, the whispers out of Dol Guldur, the stirring of darker things that watched even from the ruins of Greenwood. Dragons, he knew, were rarely left to slumber forever of their own accord. As they drew closer to the looming shoulders of the misty mountains, the ground turned harder, the trees fewer. Small streams trickled from rock faces, and strange birds flew overhead, wing beats echoing in canyons that bore no names on any chart. Snow remained in the deeper recesses, never melting entirely even in midsummer. The road bent often out of sight, threatened by landslides and broken ridges of steps long abandoned. One evening, not long after crossing an ancient stone bridge carved in the style of mountain dwarfs, Thorin sat apart from the fire, looking eastward beneath the edge of moonlight. He spoke to no one, not even Bolin that night, but his hands clasped something wrapped beneath his cloak, fragments of maps, worn coinage bearing the crest of Erebor, drawings of the Arkenstone etched from memory. Bilbo watched him under the dim sky, uncertain of what lay behind the silence. In that moment, he understood with more clarity than before that this journey was not a treasure hunt, not in any child's tale sense of the word. Thorin was not chasing wealth, though gold lay deep beneath the mountain. He was chasing the ghosts of a homeland buried alive. And because of that vow, because of the unbroken oath to reclaim what was lost, the road ahead would not be turned aside. The company would ride through fear, fire, and failure if they must, for pride was not the only thing taken by the dragon. It was identity, legacy, and root. With each day, the mountain loomed closer in their thoughts, though many miles and trials lay between. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, Smaug slept upon the bones of dwarfs, his breath thick with sickness and age-old fire. Around him, gold cooled for a time. But dragons do not sleep forever. The misty mountains rose slowly, like a grey tide swelling against the belly of the sky. At first distant, indistinguishable from low clouds beyond the horizon, they took shape as the company drew nearer. Their backs arched like slumbering giants, their shadows long even under morning sun, and their peaks cloaked in snow and age. Branches grew sparser, then fell away altogether. The trees gave way to stones, and the stones grew jagged, worn by wind and time, and the green softness of the western lands faded behind them. The road turned narrow. Here, no carts passed, no hoofprints remained from other caravans. The track wound between weather-polished stone, briars clawed from low ridges, and mist hung between rises. The land felt shrouded, not only by fog, but by something unspoken, an absence shaped by slow ruin and abandonment. Even the birds grew quiet. Bilbo found himself listening often, but not for song. There was nothing to hear but water from distant springs and the wind that moved in no direction at all. Rain fell without ceremony. It came thin at first, threading between blades of grass and staining the cloaks of riders without changing their pace. But by midday it thickened, soaking skin and bone alike. The fire, when lit beneath a curved outcrop that evening, burned low and smoked more than it warmed. Oin and Bofa set to drying gear. Thorin said nothing. Even Gandalf was slower to speak. Bilbo had never been so cold. The damp clung to him like a second skin. The food was tougher now, dried and suited more to dwarvish palate than hobbiting stomach. He ate without complaint but missed butter, warm bread, and the sound of dishes being moved over clean timbers. He dared not say aloud what echoed in his heart, that he had come without understanding, driven not by enchantment or duty, but impulse. And now, with frost beneath his fingertips, he wondered silently if that impulse had been folly. Yet even in the gloom of the relentless march, the company did not falter. The dwarfs bent their spines like oaks in wind, firm in posture and step. Their hobbit companion, smaller than all others, learned to keep pace with breath taxed and muscles weary, though no praise was offered and none expected. It was on one such evening, halfway to the eastern foot of the range, that Gandalf rode ahead to range the trail and scout the lay of the land. His absence, no new thing, still cast a subtle silence over the company, for his presence had long served as a curtain between their path and what might watch them from beyond shadows. That night, with no wizard among them, the watch was doubled. Yet the rain had ceased, and under flickering moonlight the hills glistened in silence. Fili and Kili, keen-eyed and bold, took the lead the next day, scouting overland with string bows and dwarven blades at side. They reported nothing until dusk, a flicker of firelight upon a low rise, distant yet unmistakable. Thorin halted the company in a low gully, where boulders and scrub offered cover. There was no road ahead, only stubborn grass and a single path worn down by centuries of deer. The fire, whoever had made it, did not belong to any of them. Fili had seen them first, three shapes hunched close over a spit, speaking in slow, rumbling tones. Kili had smelled charred meat and heard bones cracking. These were not men. Their arms were too long, their shoulders hunched, the firelight caught on teeth where no ordinary teeth should be. Trolls, and not the small kind whispered of in Hobbit tales. Stone-fleshed trolls, scourge of the wilder lands, who could break a sapling with a shrug and crush bone beneath careless fingers. Thorin called a council. The dwarfs spoke in low voices, their tones clipped. Some wished to draw back, to find another pass. Others argued for stealth, to approach in dark and retrieve what provisions might sit near the fire. For it was clear the trolls had meat they had not caught themselves. Likely travelers. Whether from the south or riverman from the Anduin flats, none could say. But travelers nonetheless, and dead now. It was Bilbo whom they looked to, briefly, awkwardly. Not Thorin, who gave no sign, but others in the company, remembering in whispers the wizard's insistence that a burglar, small and quiet, might serve in moments where swords could not. Bilbo, filled with reluctance, agreed. Not because he knew his skill to be sufficient, but because the moment required silence and the courage to do what the others could not. He crept close. The trolls, Bert, Tom, and William, were beasts of the older kind, speaking in broken Westron and arguing more than feasting. Their clothes were stitched together from stolen tents and animal hides, and their feet moved earth like shovels. Bilbo saw sacks piled against a rock, some torn open. Blades, pots, odd tools. He crawled near, reached for a dagger half-sheathed in leather, then a voice burst behind him. The dwarfs, unable to wait longer, had moved to intervene. Stones were thrown. Shouts cried out. And the trolls, disturbed, fell upon the company with grotesque joy. Dwarfs fought hard, but trolls fought brutal. One swing from a massive club sent Dory crashing into a thicket. Bomber was snatched by his cloak and flung aside like a sack of roots. Chains were drawn, ropes quickly wrestled onto ankles and wrists. Trolls had done this before. They moved not like wild beasts but with method, having learned over the years how best to break a line of defense. Even Thorin fell, disarmed by surprise and buried beneath his own shield. Bilbo tried to intervene, once. He leapt forward with blade drawn, an awkward gesture that might have gone unnoticed, but one troll spun and knocked the hobbit backward, breathless and dazed, sprawling near a pile of crushed helmets and flickering bones. It would have ended quickly. But then came Gandalf. The wizard seemed to materialize from the darkness, his staff raised high and voice raised not in rage, but in thunderous clarity. His words split the air like wind through granite, and the mountain peak above them cracked with sound. More than words, ancient speech, laden with power and shaped like a quarrel fitted to a room. The trolls paused, heads turned in confusion as dawn crept behind the wizard's back, pale but growing. Time stalled. Then, as the light of sun rose over the shoulder of the gorge, the stone-fleshed trolls turned to look. And in a moment longer, no moment at all, they froze where they stood, mid-gesture, now nothing but pale granite. Stone figures, eyes dull, mouths open in frozen laughter. The day broke open over unmoving shapes. The company lay bruised, bound, and gasping, some half unconscious, others in pain. Thorin did not thank Gandalf, but his eyes softened briefly. Bilbo, untouched save for pride and fear, could not speak for some time. Only when Gandalf cut the bindings and raised him gently did he find his breath again. Afterward, when the sun stood clear and the stone trolls no longer cast threat, the company searched their lair. Behind iron doors and warped tree trunks lay chests, mold-covered and cracked, filled with coin, broken shields, goblin blades, and among them things older, 3 blades of Westerness, forgotten by all but law-keepers. It was Gandalf who took the longest of them, forged in lost Gondolin and etched with runes. The shorter of the blades, still keen with a pale gleam, were gifted to Thorin and Bilbo. The sword given to the Hobbit bore no name in its own time, but would come to be called Sting, small, though bright of edge, glowing softly in goblin dark. Thus the tale of the trolls passed into their journey, a chapter shaped by luck and light. But more than treasure was gained. Bilbo had ventured forth under night and sky, afraid and unsure, and returned living. Though he had not slain, nor conquered, he had endured. And that, among dwarfs, carries more respect than the loudest boast. The rain returned by nightfall, and the hills rolled unknowable again. When the first edge of morning broke unnaturally sharp across the hills, light refracted around the unmoving forms of the trolls turned to stone. The company moved slowly among them, sore and bruised, their belongings scattered and smeared from the struggle. The craggy campsite, blackened by troll fire, still smelled of charred skins and wind-blown pine ash. A deep hush lingered in the air, not peace, but the heavy stillness that follows a brush with death unmeasured. Gandalf stood nearest to the trolls. His hand rested upon the stone shoulder of the largest, whose features were curled in mockery, mouth half open, glazed eyes widening in disbelief, frozen forever. Dori muttered something beneath his breath as he gathered the remnants of ropes and salvaged gear, but otherwise, none approached too closely. Dwarfs, even war-worn ones, understood that magic left traces, and it was no common dawn that had turned these hunters into monuments of their own hunger. Rounding the path behind their encampment, under a fallen pine warped by years of rot and clawed by the trolls' passing hands, Keely discovered the opening to a hollow concealed by slabs of rock and tangled roots. It took all their strength to lever back the stones, but the stale gust that swept out when they succeeded spoke of hidden things far older than the trolls themselves. The smell was close and dry, like dust mixed with long-cooled metal, a scent that carried the weight of ages. The cave within descended gently and widened into a low chamber, where scrap heaps, goods, and plundered items lay heaped in confusion. The trolls had long collected what they themselves could not use or understand. There were broken shields, rusted chainmail, twisted blades whose hilts bore designs now unrecognizable. Several of the company moved cautiously among the mess, hoping for supplies or something of value. Bomba found 3 entire food sacks, preserved, if slightly foul-smelling. Berlin discovered an old helm of iron inlaid with turquoise-dyed leather, its origins lost to time. And in the very deepest corner of the hoard, beneath wolf pelts and dented brassware, Gandalf pulled aside a rotted canvas covering that crumbled under his hand. Beneath it were 3 blades, long, narrow, and ancient. The hilts were of a kind none of the dwarfs recognized, but Gandalf, lowering himself to one knee, lifted each with careful reverence. They shone faintly, even indoors, their metal unstained by age. The edges glowed with a blue-white sheen under the flickering light of his staff, just a breath of color, but enough to cause murmured words to ripple through the company. These, Gandalf said softly, not to boast or explain immediately, but as one addresses memories long set aside, are not made by the hands of men or dwarfs in these later days. They were forged in Gondolin of old. Even Thorin, ever skeptical of tales too thick with wonder, drew closer to see. Gondolin, gone for many ages of the world, had been a hidden city of elves during the Elder Days, shaped in secret and overtaken by betrayal and ruin. Few things of its making had survived the downfall, and fewer still had passed into the hands of mortals or dwarfs. To find such weapons now was not only rare, it was unnerving. Gandalf took the longest of the blades and studied its runes, which curved in graceful, stern script no longer spoken aloud outside ancient halls. The others stood silent as he passed one of the shorter swords to Thorin. Its hilt was black beneath the silver inlay, and the blade felt strange to the touch, not cold or warm, but simply aware, a weapon that knew its use had not yet ended. The smallest of the 3, slender like a long dagger when measured against dwarf-made swords, was laid before Bilbo. Its surface bore no runes visible at the time, but it shimmered faintly blue where its edge met the air. At first, he hesitated. But when Gandalf nodded once, neither instruction nor command, but confirmation, he reached out and took it. "It's Elvish," Bilbo said quietly, as though speaking too loudly would break some part of the chamber. "But for me." "For you," said Gandalf, "if indeed you find yourself using it rather than letting it rust in your pack." Bilbo did not smile at the comment, though some in the company did. He studied the blade carefully. Despite its size, the balance was near perfect, and it sat in his hand easily, more like a piece of memory than a weapon. At the time he could not know that the blade would glow blue in the presence of orcs or goblins, nor that its elven forging would prove a guide through darker days. But he felt, faintly, that it had waited a long while to be taken up. Later that morning, near the heat of midday, they sealed the cave as best they could. The pile of unneeded spoils was buried or thrown down ravines. The trolls, now silent watchers, stood like statues behind a patch of battered earth and tangled underbrush. Time would pass over them, seasons fold them into legend. But the company moved on, quiet again, more cautious, as though the weight of that chamber followed distantly in their steps. As they climbed into high country again, the forest grew again in patches, small thickets of pine and yew, where birds whispered through tangled branches. Gandalf mentioned Rivendell in passing, and they turned southward toward a path few now marked, seeking the hidden valley spoken of in songs. The weather soured for a time, and even the elves of Imladris would have found the light strange through the grey veils that swept through the ridges of the world. Bilbo began speaking even less. He rode behind Gloin most often, sometimes near Ori, who jotted constantly in a worn ledger that none were allowed to see. The hobbit polished his sword at night as others sharpened tools or repaired gear. He did not name it. Not then. That would come later. But the learning of its weight, the shape of it beside his small figure, those things were being etched slowly into his bones with each mile passed. The dwarfs, most of them warriors and smiths by craft, did not speak of the swords again. But they watched the hobbit differently now. Not with respect yet, nor trust, but with something seeded, a beginning of recognition. He had walked into a troll's den, returned alive, and bore now a weapon clearly made by hands that predated even their line. Gandalf said little in the days after the discovery. But when they stopped for breath near a dry ridge of half-buried standing stones, he walked beside Bilbo for a moment without speaking. Then, as if remembering something long forgotten, he said, "In shadowed places, light sometimes finds a way." Bilbo gave no answer. He stared instead into the east, where hills slipped into foothills, and beyond them the broken teeth of the misty mountains loomed sharp, drawing near. And as they passed beneath silent trees with no name, unknowing of what would come in the dark beneath the peaks, the blades they bore, hidden relics of a war no longer spoken of, rested quietly in their sheaths, waiting once more for a world where their edge would be needed. The high passes of the western misty mountains hold their own silence, older than the trees, heavier than wind. Here, the land shrinks away from the grey stone roots of the world, as if resisting the old weight pressed down by time. Twilight seemed to come early in those days, not for lack of light but for the thickness of mist and the slow deepening of slope and elevation. From the south and north both came the voices of water, rivers unseen spilling down ridges with the sound of quiet urgency. The company journeyed now where no settlement touched the trails, through places seldom named, where paths passed straight through stone and ended only at raw escarpment. The clouds hung low above broken rocks, and the sky paled like old parchment. They pushed forward nonetheless. The ponies carefully picked their way along narrow trails. Even the most sure-footed among them moved slowly now. Some paths narrowed to no more than a cart width, flanked by sheer drops, and the wind carried the harsh spray of gathering snow. It was not yet full winter, but the bite in the air had shifted. Not cold alone, but a weight forecasting the sharp, high storms that wandered among the peaks with no warning. In such places, the dwarfs spoke little. Even Bomba, slowest and loudest of them, had grown quieter as the days turned more demanding. It was Gandalf who led them with certainty, his staff held high, clicking in rhythm upon bare stone. His guidance went beyond memory of the land. He seemed to listen to the bones of the mountains themselves, as if the roots of the cliffs whispered direction. At turns he would pause, draw long breaths deep into his chest, and then move again, never speaking aloud his reason. Had they asked, he might not have answered. Wizards carry within them knowledge that is not shaped for ordinary tongues. Then, on the 12th morning of travel since the troll horde, they came to the deep ravine with green still hidden between its sharp jaws. There, with one last narrowing descent, the land drew back suddenly, an unexpected hollow nestled between spurs of stone and shielded by walls of shadowed pine. White waters foamed along its base, and fine bridges crossed streams so clear that rocks beneath flashed sharply in the moonlight. It was dusk again. It always seemed to be dusk in that place, when they entered into the hidden valley of Rivendell. No horn welcomed them. No banner flapped across the sky. Yet birds stirred in the eaves above ancient trees, and the air itself bore a cleanliness foreign to the world beyond. There were scents of crushed leaves and distant holly, lavender, and something crisp as snowmelt. The path they followed wound not in straight line but curved gently, leading them downward in slow forgetting of the troubles left behind atop the mountains. Bilbo felt, without knowing how or why, that the land itself leaned inward here, not watching, not judging, only listening. Then voices rose through the twilight, not speech but song. Elvish, gentle in meter and unfamiliar even to Gandalf's companions. High and fair, with laughter folded into the melody like morning into mist. No faces appeared through the trees, but the presence of others was known, just beyond sight, just within hearing. The elves of Rivendell do not greet like men. They observe, hidden but near, and shroud their hospitality in mystery and marvel alike. Eventually stone steps rose underfoot, carved by long hands and maintained with quiet effort. Light glimmered beyond silver-leaved branches, and the roof of a house, neither citadel nor village, came into view. That was the last homely house, the seat of Elrond Half-Elven, Lawmaster of the West, whose memory held both sorrow and shadow, and whose gaze had watched the long march of years far beyond the reckoning of dwarfs or hobbits. There they were received, not as petitioners but as guests, unlooked for, yet not unwelcome. No feast was prepared, yet food was laid gently before them. Their arms were not taken, and yet they felt no need to reach for swords. The healing peace of the valley flowed slow and deep. Some among them, Balin and Oin in particular, watched with unease. Dwarfs seldom found comfort among elves. But Gandalf walked freely toward the main hall, his name known even among Elrond's people, and carried the authority of one beyond kin or kind. They stayed 2 nights and a day. And though much of what was spoken between Gandalf and Elrond was said behind carved doors and beneath stars unshared with dwarf folk, there were matters witnessed and moments remembered. On the second evening, after the air had turned cooler and the moon reclaimed its space above the hidden valley, the map of Erebor was brought forth. It was spread upon a stone bench that sat beneath an open archway, beyond which the Bruinen River sang softly to itself. The parchment, curled and yellow as ever, had not changed to any eye. Balin watched with arms folded. Thorin remained standing, choosing not to sit in the presence of the elf lord. But when Elrond took the map in his long fingers, his eyes narrowed faintly. He said nothing at first. Then he moved it beneath the light of the moon, which gleamed full and clean behind them. And as the moon struck the paper, unseen writing bloomed across the edges, fine strokes of silver, curling lightly like breath across glass. "Moon letters," Elrond said, softly. "Written under a during moon. They can only be read at the same phase, under the same season." He traced the script with no need to speak it. Then after a moment, he read aloud. "Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole." No one replied immediately. The gravity of the wording sank quietly into those who understood its meaning. Durin's day, a rare alignment of sun and last moon of autumn, might come once in many years. For the keyhole to be revealed then, and then only, meant that their timing would need to be precise. Elves do not rush their speech, and Elrond said nothing more until Gandalf nodded once in acknowledgement. "Your path lies far yet," Elrond said quietly. "Over Caradhras and beyond the Anduin. Erebor waits, but it is watched still. There are things in the forest that no longer sleep. You are not the only ones who walk under sign and shadow." It was not a warning, nor a blessing. Only truth. That evening, Rivendell became quieter still. Thorin did not join the others. He walked alone among the pillared lanes and gardens folded in moonlight. His face remained fixed, but in his hands he turned the map again and again, as though seeking something in it unrevealed even by the moon letters. Bilbo sat once on the edge of an overhanging balcony, legs dangling, unsure whether to feel awe or unease. Somewhere far below, owls moved between trees, and stars lit the river in thin streaks. When they departed the next morning, there were no farewells. Elrond's people did not wave banners or speak in parting poems. They simply moved aside and watched the company pass. Only Elrond himself stood at the highest arch above the gate, unmoving, and observed until the last of the ponies had disappeared under early cloud. Bilbo looked back only once. The light in the valley seemed softer than elsewhere, as though the mountains themselves leaned aside to shelter it. What lingered most in his mind was not the hospitality, the hidden wisdom, or the splendor carved into wood and stone. It was the vastness of what lay ahead, now sharpened by ancient language and moonlight truth. For Durin's day would come, and only then would the way into the mountain open. The sun and moon, indifferent to all else, marked the story. And far beyond the hidden veil, behind mountain and river and forest yet unpassed, a cold wind rippled the gold-strewn halls of Erebor, stirring the slumber of fire coiled beneath stone. Beyond Rivendell, the land ceased to guide and began instead to challenge. For though the valley had held back the wild, the world outside reasserted itself suddenly, as if aware that gentleness had gone too long unopposed. The trail narrowed beneath the vast shoulders of the misty mountains. What remained of a path was threaded through scree and shallow ravines. Old landslides, long since settled into silence, littered the route with broken stone. Snow still clung in patches to northern slopes, cold resisting the season. The company pressed forward with caution. The dwarfs took turns leading over the worst stretches, testing footholds and checking the loads on the ponies. Keely and Philly moved quickly at the edges, throwing glances up toward gullies where watchers might dwell. Thorin kept to the middle, saying little, though all could see his mood darkening as they climbed. He was a mountain-born dwarf, but these were not the halls of Erebor. These were hostile heights, marred by the claws of time and weather and worse. Bilbo often struggled to keep pace, the loose shale slipping under hobbit-sized boots. The others gave him no words of shame, but offered little comfort either. They had entered wilderness where courtesy did not follow. Above them, the sky turned turbulent. Thick clouds gathered from the south, pressed forward by winds that curved around unseen towers of jagged rock. Thunder sounded, not sharp, but low and rolling, as if stirred beneath the skin of the world. Rain did not fall immediately. Instead, the wind thickened into a constant presence, like breath whispering through each crevice, and the air grew colder by the hour. By night, they took shelter beneath an outcrop of stone, half-formed and weather-scarred, offering no more than a lean-to against open sky. Fire could not be built strongly, for there was little dry wood, and the smoke stung the eyes. Dori recounted grimly tales of trolls inhabiting old passes, and of wolves that prowled under such wind-blown skies, but no one answered. The thunder came closer by the hour, and with it, tension that none could name. When the rain came, it came all at once. It crashed over the ridges without warning, brought in sheets across the narrow ledges, driven sideways by shrieking gusts. The ponies panicked and stumbled. Packs came loose. The edge paths turned to slippery mud and stone screamed down slopes around them. Gandalf shouted above the roar, his voice nearly lost in the rain. At his urging, they sought higher ground, scrambling through the forest of stones for better cover. Lightning fractured the sky as they ducked into a shallow cave opening beneath a long slab of broken cliff. The inside was dry but offered no fire, no comfort. Borin lit a small lantern, its flickering light barely stretching to the walls. Bilbo crouched near the back, soaked and shivering. Through the narrow opening, they watched the sky war with itself, clouds cracking open in white fury. Rain hammered the rocks like hammers on anvils. It was not a passing storm. It was madness between mountains, stamping its presence across slope and shadow alike. In that half-night of restless weather, none among them slept well. The dwarfs, seasoned though they were, grumbled softly in rotations of watch. Gandalf stood near the mouth of the cave, unmoving, eyes fixed outward. Then, as the worst of the storm reached them, they began to hear something else. It was the sound of stone groaning, not from wind or water, but from deep within the mountain. Not a landslide, but a sound like doors moving over forgotten hinges, too vast to measure. Moments later, the floor beneath their feet trembled, not sharply, but pulsing like the breath of something buried. Thorin raised a hand, calling for silence. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening, too. From the rear of the cave came a crackling noise. A fissure along one side opened just wider, a hidden hinge in the rock adjusting itself. And then the ground gave way. The trapdoor had been invisible, carved by those who ruled the depths, meant to catch more than waterlogged travelers. Without warning, the floor beneath half the company fell inward, turning from stone to empty air. Bilbo, in the midst of catching his breath, tumbled forward along with Dori, Ori, and Balin. Gandalf's shout echoed dimly behind them, but it faded as they fell. Darkness swallowed them. The drop was not clean. Stone broke their fall, points and angles that jutted from the shaft, slowing the descent but bruising bone and flesh alike. Bilbo struck something hard, then something else still harder, until the final landing carried him into a mound of small bones and grit. There was no sky. No noise from above. Only flickers of amber light reflecting on tunnel walls from torches planted in sconces fashioned crudely of iron. Goblin tunnels. The dwarfs rose slowly in the half-light of the place, surrounded by clustered paths and jagged doors. Heavy footfalls echoed from deeper within, and distant shouting grew closer. They fumbled for weapons, but before hands could reach hilts, goblins swarmed out from darkened alcoves. Dozens of them, shrieking and cackling. Smaller than trolls, more nimble, but grotesque all the same. Skin stretched and knotted from heat and cruelty, clothed in scraps of leather and bent iron. They carried short, crooked swords with hooks and notches, designed for pain more than skill. The dwarfs resisted fiercely, but they were overpowered by number. Bilbo swung blindly, striking a goblin on the arm, and was seized from behind. Chains bound the company swiftly. Within moments they were dragged deeper, pulled through corridors chiseled into greasy stone, beneath stalactites and pillars of broken columns from an era forgotten. They were brought to the great goblin, in form bloated, flesh pale and unpleasant, his chin spilling down his front in folds like melted wax, and his mouth an opening filled with cracked teeth and dripping glee. He perched atop a raised slab draped in cloth stained by things unnamed. Goblins surrounded his throne platform, armed with sharp spears and louder voices. "Well, well," the great goblin crooned, "what do we have here? Dwarfs? A little overcooked for dinner, but let's see what they've brought, shall we?" Knives and cudgels began inspecting their gear. Sacks were overturned. Swords were drawn from sheaths. Then Thorin's sword, the one taken from the troll's cave, was raised into view. Its edge caught the torchlight and shimmered cold and blue. The goblins hissed and recoiled, some nearly toppling in fear. The great goblin's smile twisted downward. "Elvish blades," he growled. "Made in Gondolin." What followed was confusion. At the height of the great goblin's fury, the chamber was split suddenly by a blinding light and a voice shouted words unknown to goblin tongue. Gandalf had come, not through the paths the dwarfs had taken but through another road entirely, deeper and darker. With his staff raised and glamdring, foehammer drawn, he struck from above. The great goblin shrieked and fell from his seat with a gurgling, heavy sound, and light streamed through the chaos of blows and smoke. Released once more into flight, the dwarf struck back. Goblins scattered like dry leaves in flame, and in the mayhem, chains were broken and clubs shattered. Bilbo tried to move but was knocked down by a fleeing goblin. He rolled into shadows, dazed and alone, as the company vanished down a hall. He rose only when silence had begun to return, too late to follow. And in that moment, deep beneath the mountain, Bilbo Baggins was left behind. The blackness in the deep parts of the mountain was nearly absolute, thick, pressing, and complete. After the echoes of the goblin fight had faded and no torchlight remained to catch on stone, Bilbo stood in a silence not quite dead but listening. The tunnels there had not been carved only by goblin hands. They were older in places, seamed through with fractures and burrowings that followed no rule or pattern. The air itself was stale, the weight of unmeasured depth bearing down on quieter breath. What parts of the mountain had opened naturally and what had been torn hollow by claw or time no longer mattered. There, under impossibly layered stone, Bilbo Baggins of Bag End was alone. He wandered without light, fingertips grazing uneven walls, his blade sheathed until touch would guide no more. Feet slipped on damp patches and caught on loose stones. Direction meant nothing. Sound barely carried beyond his own footfalls. At times he believed himself turned around, looping closer toward the goblin central halls again. At others, he imagined he might reach the roots of the world, where no creature dared move, and even time slowed. Eventually, after a fall that left his palms bruised and his knees thick with grit, he came to a lower cave, damp and quiet, vast beyond anything he'd yet passed, its boundaries invisible even by feel. A thin ripple in the air hinted at the presence of water, slow and still. Somewhere nearby, a pool, not rushing but old. Bilbo crouched there, adjusting slowly to environment rather than searching for route. He no longer truly sought escape. He sought nextness, a ledge or a rope or a hope. Then he heard the patter. Not footsteps. That would be too strong. It was a kind of slapping, half padded, half smooth, a limping rhythm accompanied by breathing that rasped not with effort, but with sibilance. Somewhere across the water, or whatever lay ahead, something moved. Bilbo was not seen immediately. He stepped behind a stone outcropping, blending instinctively into darkness. The creature, when it came into patchy view, was not tall. Humanoid in broad form, but curved as if bent by years of crawling in confined space. Its skin was pale, slick in the dark like loamos or stone coated in oil. Long fingers dragged on the ground. Its eyes, large, unsupported by lids, reflected unseen light with a glint like moonlight on wet stone. Its voice was high, broken, whispering in half phrases to itself with tones that carried as much need as cunning. It called itself Gollum. Bilbo watched, uncertain whether to reveal himself or stay hidden. He had lost the others, had no food or light, and was now within reach of something not goblin yet not free of goblin shadows. The creature muttered as it moved, speaking to itself with plural references and guttural spits. Sneaky it is, we thinks, yes, precious. Very sneaky. When the two at last noticed one another, Bilbo inching back, the creature whipping toward him, neither advanced. Gollum stared with something between suspicion and calculation, swaying in place. He did not attack, not immediately. Somewhere in the folds of his mind remained enough reason to recognize this small, curious intruder was unarmed and lost. Instead, after some grumblings and many mutterings, he proposed a game. A game of riddles. Riddle games were not unfamiliar to Bilbo. In ancient tradition, they had been used in times of bitter dispute and test, especially among the oldest of families in the Westfarthing. But even riddles, here in the bowels of the world, meant more than rhyme and wit. This was no pastime. This was a trial, the agreed course of two creatures caught between fate and fear, one driven by hunger cloaked as mischief, the other by survival cloaked too thinly as courtesy. Gollum promised, in his distant and increasingly agitated way, that if Bilbo won the riddle game, he would show him the way out. If Gollum won, Bilbo would be eaten. They each accepted this without fanfare. No contract, no witness. The rules made between them were old in their own right. Then the riddles began. They started simple. Descriptions in rhyme, metaphors wrapped in ambiguity. What walks with 4 legs in the morning and 2 in the day? What devours all things, birds, stone, kings, beasts, and time? They moved in turns, the question spoken with breathless anticipation. Bilbo gained confidence slowly, recalling scraps of his father's rhymes and odd phrases from old books, saved only due to ancestors' habits of collecting dusty sayings. But Gollum's riddles were trickier, sharpened by long isolation and a mind twisted by hunger and loss. He spoke with split tongue and shadowed mind, but there was cleverness still, buried beneath decay and time. Bilbo barely answered some. Others, he solved with stammering hesitation. The exchanges lengthened. The cave echoed only with thought and the sound of their voices. Then Bilbo asked by accident. He had run out. In desperation, reaching into his waistcoat, he clutched the cold object he had found after falling, small, smooth, unnaturally weighty. He had not noted its shape clearly in the darkness. He had only felt it among the stones as something separate, perfectly round. It had nestled into his fingers like it belonged there. "What have I got in my pocket?" he asked aloud, hardly noticing he was not delivering a proper riddle. Gollum froze. It was not a riddle, not in the ancient structure. And yet it was a question. Gollum hissed and cursed, accused and complained, but Bilbo held firm. 3 guesses were the rule for each turn. That had been made clear. The creature guessed a knife, a string, a tooth. All were wrong. And with each failed try, his muttering deepened, his hostility more tangible. Bilbo was not brave, but he was no longer paralyzed either. As Gollum finally screamed in fury, flinging himself back toward the water and muttering of thieves, tricksy thieves, Bilbo stepped backward into the shadows and tried again to find his way forward, weapon in one hand, the ring in the other. He did not know what he held, only that Gollum craved it with a hatred so deep that no hunger could mask it. In truth, Gollum had once borne it, and the memory of its loss had fractured whatever he once had been. Bilbo had stumbled upon what Gollum had kept hidden even from himself. A force beyond object, a thing of power. In his escape, Bilbo encountered goblins again. They scoured the lower tunnels, clamoring for the company they had lost. He turned from them in panic, backing away, and fell. But this time, unseen. For the ring slid onto his finger even as he flinched in fear. And the world vanished. Not completely. He did not disappear from himself. But from others, yes. Where he had been, there was now nothing but air. Light moved around him strangely, breath echoed louder. The clamoring of goblins faded as they passed inches from his presence, seeing nothing. The burden of the ring, the one ring, was now his. He removed it, eventually, not understanding why the world returned when he did. But the memory of that moment would never leave him. In time it would carve away layers of who he thought he was. He returned to the company unseen. Found them climbing upward from the lower halls, mourning his loss. When he rejoined them, they questioned little. He told no lie, but he did not tell the truth. The ring remained hidden. And as they emerged from the goblin tunnels, with wind against their faces once more and stars faint and sparse above the jagged cliff edge, Bilbo walked quieter. His step was no stronger, but it fell with more certainty now. Above them, lightning no longer danced. Clouds had passed on. But in Bilbo's pocket, hanging like silence itself, the darkness remained. The exit from the goblin tunnels came not with ceremony or praise, but with weary limbs and silence. The air outside, so sharp and cold upon the face, felt alien after the breathless black beneath the mountain. The sky had cleared during their flight, leaving the night bruised with stars in white clusters that blinked across the edge of the vast void above. They emerged on a narrow slope clinging to the side of the eastern misty mountains, where no road led and no shelter welcomed. The climb had been long and frantic, driven upward by fear, smoke, and the shouts of goblin voices from behind. Their descent had become a flight rather than a retreat, and when they finally stood under the starlight, few among them could speak. Bilbo collapsed onto a bare rock ledge, clutching his sides, lungs burning from the climb. His clothes were torn at the sleeves, and his hair clung damp across his brow. The others fared little better, scraped and dirt-smeared, armor loose or broken, packs lost or slung awkwardly across shoulders. They stood now small and vulnerable before the vast descent that awaited them below. Ahead, the land rolled downward in coarse ranges, patched here and there with sparse pine and red-tinged stone. Behind, the dark throat of the mountain loomed black. But danger had not passed. Even as the company gasped through sore throats and sought their bearings, wild cries rose in the night air, not from goblins this time, but from a deeper, older malice that stirred beyond ridge and hollow. The howls came from wargs, the great wolves bred for war and bound by ancient hate to the goblin kind. Whether summoned by the alarm of the goblin defeat or stirred by darker forces of their own, they came swift and sure, bounding upward through cutbacks, leaping crags, and shale with practiced precision. Gandalf's eye swept the valley before the sound ever reached them. He turned once, called to the dwarfs, and drew them again into motion. They fled across the ridge, moving toward a narrow outcrop of trees that clung to the slope like scattered teeth. The company sought no confrontation now, only height. And in the crook of an ancient pine-covered shoulder, they found a series of trees tall and close enough to offer a meager defense. They did not speak. There was no time. They simply climbed. Bilbo found himself pressed higher and higher, fingers gripping bark split by weather, legs scraped and trembling. Dory hauled him by the wrist once, hoisting him onto a branch too slick for a hobbit's foothold. Bomba struggled below, barely fitting between the trunks. Thorin, nearer the base, stood sword drawn, watching the gap in the rocks where the wolves would break through. And then fire bloomed beneath them. The wargs came with riders. Goblins clung to their backs, armed with torches dipped in pitch, and the flames they cast ignited not only fallen brush but the peeling bark of the dry trees. Smoke rose in thick spirals. Gandalf, from the top of one pine, roared words that cracked like thunder. Sparks leapt. Fire was matched by fire as he hurled down burning pine cones lit by old magic, each one bursting in unnatural blue or red flame, scattering the goblins momentarily. But it could not last. The blaze caught faster than the wind could carry it away. The wolves, fearless in madness, snapped at tree roots and clambered upward with talons and howls. The trees groaned with flame. The edge of the outcrop began to smoke from beneath, and the air grew tighter, choked with heat and ash. The dwarfs, pressed together on limbs too thin for safety, looked now not toward battle, but to the hopeless rock spire of the cliff's edge. They could go no higher. Then, above the roar below, beyond the shrieks and crashing boughs, there came a new sound. It began as a distant beating, faint but marked by rhythm too measured to be storm, too strong to be mere wing. It grew with terrifying speed, as if summoned from memory itself, a beating of vast pinions, ancient and wide. And then came the eagles. They did not cry aloud as smaller birds do, nor call out in greeting. They came without warning on the currents of night air, as if shaped by it, their massive wings catching moonlight in flashes of grey and silver. The first circled tightly above the burning branches. The next stooped and swept low, talons wide, catching a goblin mid-leap and dashing it with silent precision. More followed, and panic broke across the creatures below. One by one, the great eagles descended, their wings stirring the flames and smoke into swirls of nightsoot. They plucked goblins and wargs alike, scattering the attack and driving the beasts back down the slope. Their arrival was not grace. It was force, executed with terrible speed and perfect stillness of purpose. Then they turned upward. One by one, they seized the dwarfs from the trees. Not gently, but not unkindly either. Beak and talon gripped cloak and collar, lifting each member of the company aloft from the inferno beneath. Thorin, at first, refused, sword slashing even as the eagle held him. Only when Gandalf barked a command in a high and forgotten tongue did the king relent. Bilbo was the last. Clutching the trunk of the tree, he looked down at the flame-lit slope, where his path might have ended in teeth and smoke. Then he was taken, swept up with wind howling past him, his heart thudding not from fear alone but from the shock of rising faster than thought. The ground disappeared below like a discarded memory. The air grew thin. The stars unfolded before him. They passed over forests black with depth, overlands unused to light or sound. The cold returned across his skin, chasing the fire smell from his clothes. The wings carried them not far, but far enough, westward by a league or two, until the trees below thickened and the slope fell away into a high valley rimmed by rock yet untouched by flame. There they were set down, one at a time, on a ledge ringed by ancient stone, cold and wind-carved. The eagles did not speak, though their eyes conveyed thought deeper than beast or bird. The leader, taller and broader than the others, bore a scar across one talon and watched the wizard with that calm, judging gaze unique to the firstborn creatures of the sky. He was Gwaihi, Lord of the Eagles. Friend once to the grey Pilgrim, held by alliance but not servitude. Their bond, forged in times older than the world of hobbits or the line of Durin, held still on this night. No word of thanks was exchanged. None was needed. The eagles vanished into the dark sky again after a time, wings spread to the north, leaving the company alone once more, battered, burned, weary. Alive! Dawn broke slowly. A pale streak along the crest of the ridge, cold as water and softer than snow. The tree line crawled uphill ahead of them, and the valley below whispered with hidden streams. The goblins would not pursue them now. Whatever dwelled in that region was wary of eagles, and even more afraid of fire that had once danced at the roots of mountain trees. Bilbo sat alone near the edge for a long while. His blade lay across his knees, still faintly glowing from past dangers. He did not yet understand what he had survived, or how close he had come to death, and not for the last time. But something in the flight had shifted him. The sky had shown him something the tunnels could not: the distance, breadth, the scale of the world. The mountains were not the end. They were barely even the edge of it. The others stirred slowly. Voices returned. Packs were refound, torn garments inspected, bruises gathered like small trophies. And then Thorin stood and turned toward the Hobbit. Something in him was heavier than before. He said no thanks aloud. Kings of his kind did not often do so, but he looked at Bilbo differently. Where once there had been deep skepticism, there was now the beginning of regard. Not warmth, but recognition. "You have more about you than I had guessed, Master Baggins," he said, and then turned away. Bilbo said nothing. The wind stirred behind him. And far off, beyond valley and range, a lonely mountain bled golden light into the eastern sky, too far to see, but present now in every step that would come after. The valley where the eagles had set them down was bare of pathway or dwelling, hemmed on all sides by steep descending crags and wide slopes carpeted in pine and low thorn. Behind them, the misty mountains still pierced the western sky like broken spears, and before them lay the thin line of the Anduin's tributaries, meandering in glints of half-seen silver. It was toward those lesser waters that Gandalf guided them now, not toward the river itself, but to a hidden glade that lay among the foothills, unseen from above, and unannounced on any map drawn by dwarfs or men. The company moved carefully through the thick underbrush, limbs still sore from the escape, feet blistered, and provisions nearly gone. Their clothes bore the stench of smoke and goblin musk. What little food remained was dry and crumbling. No one spoke of turning back. There was no path west anymore. Only the skin of the frontier lay ahead, and old roads forgotten by most, roads Gandalf alone recalled, though he did not name from where such memory came. They followed him down into a low wooded region where the trees grew thicker and stranger, their trunks gnarled, bark smooth as knotted skin, and their canopies wide enough to block the sun long into the morning rise. Through this they travelled in pairs, hands on hilts, speaking low if at all. The signs of life became scarce, no birdsong, no scurry of animal paws, only the occasional claw marks on tree bark and crushed fern beds where something wide and heavy had passed through. By evening, Gandalf instructed them not to light a fire. In silence, they camped beneath a great oak, and he advised them only this: keep company close, and show no fear, but speak no lies should you be asked. The next day came dimly through tree shadow and drifting fog, and by midday they emerged onto open grassland once more, where the trees fell back and the great green shoulders of the land lifted toward a sloping hilltop crowned by a solitary rock. This was the Carrock, a rough stone promontory that stood above the surrounding fields like a watchtower shaped by time rather than tool. It was from there, Gandalf said, that the creature they sought sometimes came and went, an old being, wild of mood and slow to trust. Bein. The name meant little to Bilbo at first, and not much more to the dwarfs, whose dealings had rarely brought them so far from mountain and market. But Gandalf spoke clearly. Without Bein's aid, they would not cross the lands that lay ahead. For eastward of the Carrock lay the forest of Mirkwood, vast, tangled, and ill-governed. The road through it was long and dangerous, and there were powers in that shadowed wood that hid not only from sight but from sense. If they hoped to survive it, they would need rest, supplies, and perhaps even beasts to bear their weight. That night, Gandalf went forward alone. He approached the house of Bein with none of the dwarfs in tow, instructing them to wait near the edge of a long hedge line that circled part of the meadows. His departure came without argument. There was something in his posture when he spoke of the skin changer that discouraged even Thorin from questioning. They made camp again, low to the ground. The ponies fed lightly on the sparse grass. The wind changed directions more than once. When Gandalf returned, it was nearly dawn. His robes were damp with dew and forest scent. He bid the dwarfs follow, but not all at once. Bein's temper, as he explained in that early light, was not kindly towards strangers or disruption. He valued peace but did not trust numbers. So they came in pairs, 2 by 2, timed apart, while Gandalf wove a singular narrative of their journey and plight, building slowly toward their full company assembly. Beorn received them in his own way, with silence at first, and watchful eyes. His hall was large, shaped of timber joined without nail or iron, carved in places with depictions of animals and ancient sigils none now could read. No fire burned unnecessarily. The walls bore trophies of antler and paw. Side rooms opened into bread rooms, smoke lofts, stables, yet no servant came or stirred. The house was tended and kept by Beorn alone. At first glance, he could have been mistaken for some tall, silent woodsman. But no ordinary man bore such strength of arm or width of step. His hands were broad like shovels, and his beard ran black across his chest. His voice, when it came, was deep and flat and slow, not dull, but carved smooth by long solitude. And there was in his manner something akin to the creatures of the forest, wary, powerful, never fully still. Yet he let them stay. At his table was simple fare, loaves of honey bread, bowls of butter-thick milk, berries gathered fresh, and cakes made of nuts and root. Meat was absent. When asked, Beorn answered flatly, "I keep no cattle. Nothing I kill with spear." Yet they did not hunger. His land provided abundantly, and Bilbo in particular found strange comfort in the food, not only in taste, but in the calmness it seemed to carry. Over the next day, Beorn listened as Gandalf recounted their crossing of the Misty Mountains, their flight from goblins, and their survival in Flame and Fang. He asked few questions, but his gaze moved from dwarf to dwarf, pausing longest on Thorin, whom he called by name only once, and with weight. "And so the heir of Erebor wanders homeless still," he said. "No throne but fire. No hall but cave. You seek your mountain not for gold alone." "No," Thorin answered. Beorn nodded. "Good. There is too much greed in this age." In time, he opened his stables to them. Great ponies grazed under his care, larger than those seen in the West, unsaddled, yet gentle to trained hand. He provided them with skins filled with fresh water, bags of dried cakes, and hooded cloaks to guard against the forest air. Everything done was without speech of repayment. Yet the understanding lay quietly in place. His hospitality was not granted freely to all. It was earned, and could be lost. On the third morning, before they departed, they saw Beorn no longer in man shape. He was in the fields, massive and dark-haired, no longer upright, but padded forward on 4 legs, his back arched and his snout close to the earth. He moved with purpose, murmuring low growls toward the edges of his lands. Wolves had come near in the night, their prints lay in the field. Beorn had hunted them off. No one pursued. They left before sun could glare too hot against the treetops. The ponies bore them swiftly, the road sloping now toward darker lands ahead. Beorn walked with them part of the morning, returning only when they passed beyond the reach of his highlands. No parting words were shared. He simply watched, a towering figure at rest on the Carrock crest. And when the trees of Mirkwood rose like a wall horizon-wide before them, black and tangled with age, they understood what Beorn had already known. The road behind had brought them far. The road ahead would not remember kindness. Along the border of Mirkwood, the world grew heavy. The path they stood before, though marked in Gandalf's memory and shaped by old use, had the look of something that had never been intended to be found. No sign stood. No fence or landmark broke the endless wall of interlocked trees. Even the hills grew quiet here, no cricket chirp or whisper of rabbits in the grass. The very earth had turned still, as though listening. The forest spread before them in great waves of black-green, each bough tangled with the next and each trunk twisted in postures that defied wind or weather. The light that touched the canopy above was thin and colorless. Beneath it, the forest floor was littered with roots sharp as claws, with moss that glowed faint in certain grooves, and with fungi bloated and pale under the black bark of rotting birches. There was no road, not anymore, but an overgrown trail, choked by 100 seasons of inattention, ran east through the trees. This was the old forest road, once trodden by dwarfs and elves and traders from Thranduil's realm, but now only remembered in broken verse and half-maps held by those who survived its crossing. Here, Gandalf departed. He left not through argument, but in silence. The company watched him turn from the path, pulling his cloak against the breeze, vanishing with only a final word of warning, "Stay on the path." There was no noticing where he went. One moment he stood there, dusting his sleeves, and the next he was gone, as if the forest itself had swallowed him willingly. Without the wizard, the company felt smaller, though their numbers had not changed. The dwarfs said little of their unease, but their eyes lingered more often on shadows, their hands rested more frequently on hilts. Even Thorin, stone solid in bearing, seemed to scan behind them more than before. Upon entering Mirkwood, the first sensation was not fear, but confusion. The trail, visible for the first hour, quickly narrowed to a suggestion. The trees grew thicker, stretching over the path in permanent twilight. What ought to have been midday swiftly dimmed. No bird sang. No sun broke through. A quiet settled unlike any other they had known, a silence not born of absence, but of pressure, as if something unseen was pressing against every sound made. Bilbo walked near the middle of the group. His thoughts, already burdened, began to slip sideways. Time lost meaning. Meals were eaten not by the hour, but when exhaustion demanded. Sleep came in odd bursts, and waking held no assurance that it had passed. The path twisted subtly, never quite turning but always disorienting. Trees repeated themselves, or perhaps they always looked the same. There was no motion in the branches, and yet leaves turned slightly, as if touched by breaths not their own. They traveled eastward for what they counted as many days, though it had become impossible to tell which days were which. The track beneath their feet sloped at times, rising when it should not, falling into hollows where fog waited unnaturally. Food began to dwindle. Water went carefully measured, for the streams they saw, and they were few, bore no smell of purity. Some trickled like oil, coated with film. Others sang to themselves in musical notes that made the hair behind the ears raise without warning. Night grew indistinguishable from day. And then came the lights. At first, faint flashes. Then more regular, pale yellows, blue flickers, like lanterns pass swiftly through distant hollows. On one night, they heard flutes, high and thin, rising like a memory through the trees. Dori spoke of wood elves, watchers of Thranduil's realm, but Thorin doubted it. These elves did not call. They did not show their faces. And whatever brightness they shed did not warm the leaves. Then came the spiders. Not in full at first, but webs. Strands thick like wire stretched between trees, draped across the path, sewn across hollows to catch the waking or unwary. The dwarfs slashed at them when found. The shapes recoiled into shadows. But the webbing grew denser. Trees were wrapped in veils, and the path pressed through tunnels of silk. Filaments moved with breath not of wind but of limb. Bilbo was the first to be caught alone. In reaching ahead with Sting, now glowing faintly, he ventured a dozen paces too far under a tree-laced arch. A thread descended unseen. It caught his sleeve, and before he could shout, another curled around his back. He spun and cut, but a third gripped his ankle. Panic surged like winter through him. He cut again, wildly, Sting's glow igniting to blue-white. That flick of bright resistance seemed to drive the shape back. He fell back toward the company, shaking, the thread remnants hanging limp like broken vines. The others barely had time to react before the assault began in earnest. They came fast and quiet, too many legs, eyes that blinked without sound, and fangs that dripped something darker than mere venom. The trees above pulsed with weight. Long filaments dropped from every limb, threading the air until the canopy became a net. The dwarfs fought where they could, their blades whirring, but one by one, they were stung, knocked back, wrapped and dragged. Each dwarf, caught in turn, vanished into cords of silk. Bilbo was last to fall. Not by ambush, but by shock. He stood amid swirling webs, Sting held weakly in his hand, and watched as the forest fell quiet again. His companions rolled like leaves into trunks above him, silenced and still. And then silence. He moved again, not from valor, but from sheer refusal to remain the only one left standing. Climbed. Tracked the shifting silk. Listened for the scuttling rhythm. He followed to the glade where the spiders had gathered to feed. They chirped in dry tones, clacking jaws, discussing their prey in a tongue gone unused above ground for many ages. Their words were bitter and amused. "Fat little meats," they said. "Easy catch, and so many feet, yet none escaping." Bilbo did not wait. He crept through the high branches, Sting drawn and ready. Then he struck. It was not instinct. It was something old, sharp-edged, and utterly present. He slew the first from behind, cutting its body from the branch with a single slice. Another turned too slowly. A third flinched and tried to flee, but Bilbo drove Sting into its underside as if it were no more than flesh. The blade, ancient and goblin-honed, passed through web and chitin alike. He fought not like a warrior, but like one who has abandoned the fear of defeat. With speed unpracticed but sure. When the last spider turned and hissed, recoiling from Sting's glow, Bilbo shouted, a cry wordless but full. The spider fled into shadows. Then Bilbo cut them down, one by one. Filly, Balin, Bofa, Bomba, Thorin last of all. None dead, but all slowed with poison and shivering under silk. He slashed them free until he could no longer lift his arms. By their fire that night, small and carefully lit, he told briefly what he had done. They listened with gazes unhidden. Recognition had come. The little burglar had found himself. Thorin stood, not easily, and looked to his company gathered, sleep-lidded and bruised. "If we live to see the mountain," he said, "it will be because of you." He did not say more. But later, as the moon shone through a sudden break in the trees, Bilbo named his sword. Sting. For the spiders whose death mark it bore, and for the silence that it had broken. And from that night onward, he walked not at the rear, but in the middle, where those who guide the rest often stay. The wood grew no lighter after the spiders were driven off. If anything, the shadows deepened, as though offended by the intrusion. The path, such as it was, continued to wind through glades so choked with moss and vine that no direction could be made with any certainty. The canopy above pressed so heavily against the sky that days and nights passed with hardly a difference. Though they had resumed their eastward journey, With ponies long gone and stores depleted, the company moved as if submerged, slow, cautious, and swallowing hard against a rising weariness that came not from distance alone, but from something within the air itself. The memories of the spider glade still lingered in their eyes, its silk-strewn trees now nothing more than a receding line in a forest that had no end. Hobbits may not be creatures of sword or law, but Bilbo had severed more threads than the rest that day, and the company looked to him now with new regard. Even Thorin, who held praise as a rare coin, watched the Hobbit with a glance not sharpened by doubt, but honed with measured respect. Still, no safety could be claimed in that forest, and no victory could make the hunger less or the air less stifling. Mirkwood had no straight course, no markers save the aching of their own feet. At times they passed beneath great arches formed by entwined roots that should never have grown that way. At others, they stumbled across half-swallowed statues bathed in moss, faces of men or elves eroded into silence. Once they passed beneath a bridge collapsed in on itself, whose stones bore faint carvings of deer and suns, the language of a people who had long since abandoned the keeping of that road. The silence was no longer merely absence. It was warning. Then the river came. It did not appear gradually, nor as a brook building to a stream. It came suddenly, steep-banked and sluggish, black as pitch and nearly still. The current, when it moved at all, did so with a kind of reluctance. The trees on either side leaned over it as though watching, their branches curling inward as if in mourning. This was the enchanted stream, spoken of even in Hobbiton hearsay, not by that name, but in passing reference, as something one did not drink from, did not swim in, and did not linger beside. The company sought a crossing and found only a thin rope stretched across its width, frayed and sagging with years. An old boat remained moored to the far shore with a slack line, scarcely visible beneath the bows. It was Philly who first attempted the retrieval, aided by Keely and Dory with a makeshift hook and a great deal of muttered caution. Eventually, they drew it back. In twos, they ferried themselves across. Then, in an instant no one expected, a great deer burst from the underbrush and leapt into sight. Thorin raised his bow and loosed a shot. The arrow struck true, but not before the deer bounded toward them midstream. The shock caused Bombur to stumble. He cried out, arms flailing, and tumbled backward into the blackness. It took all of them to drag him out. They built no fire that night, only a shallow bed of leaves where Bombur lay, eyes closed, breath rising in rhythmic sleep from which he would not wake. The enchantment had taken him. For days after, he slept on, even as they bent to carry him through thickening thorns and across tree roots that gnarled beneath their steps like the ribs of buried giants. They did not curse him for the burden. His breath remained gentle, and his dreams, when he spoke, seemed to be of food, of dancing, and of rivers that did not speak. But the weight strained them nonetheless. When they came upon another rise, marked by outcroppings of black stone shaped like spears, the east was still beyond reach, and their food was long exhausted. Then came the fires. Not theirs, others. Pale and flickering, like festival torches. They danced in circles somewhere between the trees ahead, vanished, then reappeared again. Songs came from the distance. Soft and melodic, not goblin dirges now, but high voices, delicately sung, rising like wind between harp strings. Elves. The company hesitated. Despite the odds, they crept forward. Their steps slow, their posture low. When they came upon the lights again, they found no singers. Only a circle of cleared space, torches against trees, a feast partly laid, steaming dishes that smelled of roast and root, of bread still warm and untouched. They stood no chance against temptation. Dwarfs pressed forward, Bilbo with them. They stepped into the clearing, and the lights vanished. The firelight dropped into darkness as if smothered by giant hands. The food turned to shadows. The voices were gone. In their place, only trees. This happened not once, but thrice. Each time, vanished. Each time, the forest swallowed them deeper. And then they were taken. Elves of the woodland realm descend not with swords raised or banners spread wide, but as silence itself. It was no ambush, the dwarfs had crossed unseen thresholds. Thorned nets fell upon them like woven branches. Mithril cords, not true silver, but bright in sheen, bound wrists and ankles. Elven guards, faces unreadable beneath the silver-green helms, herded them together, sparing no word save what duty required. Bilbo, missed in the scuffle, slipped into the underbrush. Invisible still, for he had worn the ring when the trap sprung. Unseen, unheard, he followed the company. The halls of Thranduil, king of the woodland realm, were unlike those of other elves. Built in the fashion of his kin but drawn deep into the earth, his realm was half fortress, half forest spire, shaped by tree and stone together. Carved tunnels led into sweeping halls lit by floating glows, neither torch nor crystal. The guards bore no trumpet. Their language was calm, clipped. Joy among them was soft, and their power veiled. Thranduil sat upon a throne of crafted wood, the grain twisted like living vines, his shoulders wrapped in a robe whose color shifted with the torchlight. His crown was of berries and thin-beamed antlers, twisted newly for that season. His face, pale and striking, bore no smile. He spoke to Thorin by name, had done so before Thorin named himself. Yet no alliance bloomed. The history between the Longbeards and the woodland realm was not friendly. The elves had offered no help in the long exile after Smaug seized Erebor. Thranduil had closed his gates, watching but not acting. And the dwarfs, in pride and pain, had not forgotten. "I know why you go east," the Elvenking said, "and I will not hinder you. But you trespassed here armed, and you entered without greeting." Thorin did not bend. "We are no beggars, and we tolerate no jailer." So they were bound, not cruelly, but firmly, and taken to the lower halls, cells shaped with beauty even yet. Doors of slattered wood and iron threads, walls polished as bark touched by moonlight. Each dwarf was imprisoned alone. They were given food, but not familiar company. Spoke only to guards when spoken to. No trial, no torture. Time passed differently in those halls, measured not in days but in silences between footsteps. Bilbo crept still, unseen, slipping from stair to beam, discovering paths not watched and storage rooms not guarded. He found his way to the upper halls often, listening to Thranduil speak to his advisors, learning of border troubles, of growing tension among the woodland creatures, of darker things waking beyond the ruined southern glens. He also found the keys. The jailer, fond of wine and absent-minded laughter, kept them nearby more often than usual. Bilbo waited, for time, for pattern, for habit, and then took them lightly, one at a time. When the barrels came, wooden, sealed, used for trade, meant to be floated down the river and pulled by elves waiting at the river mouth, Bilbo knew his plan was ready. He unlocked each door before the guard stirred. Whispered instructions. No argument was made. Pride gave way to realization. The dwarfs were placed in barrels, one by one, sealed by the same care the elves used for wine. And Bilbo, wet and bruised but grinning faintly, clung to the curve of an empty cask, fingers clutching plated wood, as the gates of Thranduil's realm groaned open, and the river took them. The forest was not behind them. Not fully. But the company, bruised and soaked, passed from prisoner to fugitive in the same silence that had taken them captive. The dark halls faded into distance downstream, and the first mountain wind met them like a whisper on the cheek. The barrels floated downstream with the soft thudding rhythm of riverwood meeting current and the hollow slap of uneven water upon warped staves. The forest river was slow at first, winding its way out of the woodland realm with unhurried turns through narrowed clefts, thick with sedge and alder. But as they moved farther from the carved gates of Thranduil's halls, it quickened. The woods thinned. The trees bent outward, no longer arching above like prison bars, but shrugging back down into the tangled banks. The dwarfs, trapped in their barrels, were not entirely silent. From within some of the casks came muffled grunts, ill-timed curses, and more than one sloshing complaint. Bomba's barrel in particular rocked unstable with each shift in weight, and Ori's was visibly leaking near the base, drawing in small rivulets of river foam. Yet for all their discomfort, they were now, at last, beyond the shadow of Mirkwood, set adrift by river and chance onto a road untraceable by Thranduil's patrols. Bilbo rode none too comfortably either. Though not sealed within a barrel, he had clung to the side of a half-empty one, soaked to the ribs, his fingers scarred raw from the iron-riveted rim. His legs cramped from the hold. He shivered not only from cold, but from relief drawn too thin. The plan had worked, but it had not worked well. He had underestimated the violence of the water downstream and had counted on more protection from the barrel itself, only to find each jolt against a rock transmitted directly into his frame, like small echoes of being beaten by the valley itself. But he said little, indeed, there was no one to say it to. His only company now was the river, the barrels, the warming breeze, and the sound of the slow, widening current. They passed signs of change. The riverbanks began to widen. The trees, so close together in Mirkwood, now gave way to fields and carved banks tangled with reeds. Low docks of rotting timber occasionally appeared, disused and forgotten, built for wine loading long ago. Now they stood barely ankle-high above the stream, overgrown with moss and draped in weeping foliage. By evening, the current had settled further, and the bend of the river brought into view something that had not been seen in weeks, a wide lake, still and steel-grey as dawn-flushed iron, stretching into the belly of eastern hills. And rising at the foot of that lake stood a city built not by craftsmen of stone, but by engineers of timber, whose walls did not rise from earth or cliff, but from pilings driven deep into water. Lake Town. Esgaroth. Built long ago by men who chose trade over towers, this settlement floated upon its own causeway, its houses lifted high above the dark lake water, roofs shingled in overlapping wood, chimneys bent like thin eyes into the sky. Narrow streets carved of plank and rope connected the dwellings. Against the western breeze, boat flags flickered like faded tapestries sewn to shadow. Lake Town was a city more than it was a fortress. It thrived not through arms, but through tolls, barges, and the wary goodwill of nearby realms, Thranduil's woods to the north, the empty dale lands to the east, and the mountain ever watching from its distance to the north. The barrels drifted toward the town's western booms, where collectors worked with poles and ropes, herding cargo from the elves into dry docks. That morning, a man with grey in his beard and dirt beneath his fingernails leaned low from a mooring post to catch the first barrel. His boots were soaked. He muttered half-rhymes to himself as he worked. Then Bomba's barrel rolled over, burping loudly as it nudged against the piles. The man backed up with a start. And Bilbo, pale and wet, emerged from the waters beneath the last barrel, gasping, and coughing as he scrambled half-blind over the slippery wood. That was the first sight of the strangers, and the moment Lake Town's quiet day ended. The guards were slow to muster. But eventually they came, summoned more by chaos than command, long-coated men with spears borrowed from older wars, looks of suspicion stronger than their grip on the polearms they carried. They did not yet know who these dwarfs were, nor why they arrived bound in barrels and stinking of wine. But their arrival did not go unnoticed. At the head of the wooden walkways, above the first tier of timber stairs that led to the city's heart, stood the master of Lake Town, fat with flattery, thin with nerve, and weighed down by the gold-trimmed robes of elected office. He maintained order outwardly, but not all decisions passed through his hands. Beside him and not beneath him stood Bard. A bargeman by trade, keeper of vessels and watcher of winds, Bard bore no title higher than his work, but among the people his word passed with subtle weight. His lineage carried old strength, not by claim or gold, but through stories his family had carried since the fall of Dale. And in his eyes, the mountain still loomed far too close. So when Thorin declared his name, standing proud even waterlogged, and named himself son of Thrain, son of Thor, rightful king under the mountain, Bard did not cheer. His jaw set with the weight of withheld warning. The master, however, delighted in the performance. For the dwarfs brought tales of treasure, and with treasure came promises. The songs spoken by half-drunk minstrels in the taverns of Esgaroth spoke of dragon slaying, of gold unmeasured, and of the return of glory to the lake. If Thorin succeeded, should he survive the mountain and the fire sleeper within, it was said the gold would flow into Lake Town like tidewater returning to shore. The master spoke these dreams aloud in his great house, raising goblets to futures that had not begun. He clothed the company not richly, but in dry garments. He fed them salt fish and bread thick with honey milk, and let them rest beneath his roof. The people cheered. But Bard watched in silence. He alone remembered the fire. He remembered the shape in the sky that did not pass with time. As night fell and Lake Town glowed gently along the lake's calm surface, Thorin stood alone at the eastern pier, eyes fixed toward the north. For across the lake, beyond reeds and winter-tainted winds, the lonely mountain rose for the first time in their view. And it did not shine. It loomed. Dark at the summit, bent around itself, a broken crown of fractured heights. A bear wound at its southern base, a wound that was once a gate. Smoke still issued from it, slow and faint, as though breath waited just beyond. Smaug still lived. In the hush of night, even the lake seemed reluctant to carry that name. Bilbo came quietly beside him, weary but dry at last, hood drawn over curls stiff with salt. Behind them, the company slept or scattered in the warmth of shelter denied them for too long. Even now, the Hobbit said little. But he, too, stared north. The road ahead was not marked by flame. It was marked by silence, heavier than words, heavier than gold. They would cross the lake tomorrow. And each step toward the mountain would be a step taken beneath the dragon's long shadow. In the grey light of early morning, the company set out from Lake Town. Their journey across the still waters began not in triumph nor fanfare, but beneath a quiet sky that pressed low upon the lake like ash not yet fallen. The townsfolk gathered at the docks did not raise their voices again. The novelty of Thorin's lineage had been replaced by a solemn awe, as though they watched not men going to claim a birthright, but wanderers walking toward a grave mound left half open. A boat was provided, wide, shallow-hulled, suited for cargo but made ready with bundles of dry wood, rope coils, and stores packed in oilcloth. Bard watched them off without word. His brow held the same suspicion it had from the first moment he'd heard the name of the mountain aloud. The lake was still. No wind passed. The surface mirrored sky and peak alike with uncanny clarity, save where the oars disturbed it. The cold deepened as they went. Bilbo, seated near the boat center with knees drawn close, felt each pull of the oar as if the motion carved a path deeper into things unspoken. The further north they traveled, the more the lake changed. Shorelines withdrew, crumbled into sharp slate and dark gravel. The wildlife grew silent, even the windless trees distant from the water. The mountain, once faint on the horizon, now filled the sky in full. Its slopes were bare, its peak sheared, and no snow clung to its crown. No light glinted from its heights except cold reflection. It felt not like a destination, but a watching thing. At last, they reached the lake's northern edge. The boat was run onto a pebbled shore bordered by reeds browned out of season. Above them, the lonely mountain stood not far, its base cloaked in scrub and dark stone, blotched with the scars of old ruin. The air smelled not of fresh earth, but of age, dry, burned stone and wind that had passed through no leaves. They marched from the lake with care. Thorin led, though his gait was slower than once it had been. He carried no banner. The swords at their sides drew no blood from living foes, but each footfall carried them across old bones nonetheless. They passed the ruins of Dale first. It did not rise abruptly, as some ancient cities do, with towers and gatehouses that signal a people's pride. Rather, its bones spread in quiet confirmation of past grandeur broken. Stone walls lay breached and abandoned. Tiles once painted in red and green were dulled by age and soot. Hollow houses open to the wind like broken teeth, their wooden roofs long since burned and caved. Statues stood in cracked poses, noble faces chipped away. Dust curled in corners where once voices of men and children had echoed beneath banners of trade and festival. They said little. Dwarves, though not men of Dale, felt the wound of ruin nonetheless. Few had seen the city in life. Most had only known the tale. Thorin alone had walked there as a child. He did not point, and he did not slow his pace even when passing the wide promenade that looked up toward the gate of Erebor, that once echoed with laughter and barter and now heard only wind. Bilbo lingered once in an alley, drawn not by any memory but by a small heart-shaped stone still placed in a niche above a ruined doorway. Likely unnoticed and unworthy by any gold-seeker or sword-bearer. He touched it briefly, without thought, and then moved on. They made their camp that night beneath an outcrop near the mountain's base, surrounded on three sides by low crumbling walls, the last remains of what might once have been an outer watchtower. The sky above was bare. No clouds passed. The stars blinked without warmth. The air had a strange bitterness to it. Each breath carried something metallic and cold, as if the mountain exhaled a memory that did not fade. In the morning, they began the ascent to the secret door. The gate of Erebor, once grand, flanked by statues and archways of carved stone sophisticated beyond human craft, had long since been sealed, its steps broken by the heat of dragon fire. Thorin would not approach it, not yet. Instead, he led the company along the western slope, where a narrow path bent up a shoulder of the mountain. Here the rock jutted outward, its edges hard and flint-colored. Loose shale shifted beneath their boots. The climb was long, and no bird circled above. It was Balin, consulting both memory and map, who found the ledge first. Higher than one might expect, behind a fall of stone that seemed ordinary to the untrained eye, the secret door remained. Sealed tight, invisible except where craft left subtle lines. No hinges, no handle. Only a flat vertical seam and the outline where dwarf masons had blended rock and device so cleverly that the passage might stay hidden even from those who lived beside it. None could force it. Thorin knew this. They were early yet, too early for Durin's day. The sun had not reached the point on the year when moon and setting light would meet and speak the name of kings. So they waited. They prepared the platform before the door, set stones to sit, lit small fires beneath cracks in the rock. They watched. Sometimes the dwarfs would murmur of how this valley had once known traders from all free lands, of how the king beneath the mountain had held court in splendor. Bilbo listened, but said little. And as the days passed, a shadow grew. Not from the sky, not from any outward threat, but from within the mountain itself. For the mountain was not silent. During the fourth night, Bilbo woke to it. A low thrum, like the breath of a great forge, pulsed beneath the stone. Not loud, but palpable, as if the rock itself still remembered flame. His hand, placed upon the ground, felt it, a slow rhythm, like a heart asleep but dreaming. None spoke of it openly, but all felt it. Especially Thorin. His gaze changed. It had grown sharper, drawn inward, as though something within had begun to shift. He walked late into the night. He stared not at the stars but at the door. His words, when spoken, became shorter. His dreams haunted by something stronger than vision. The Arkenstone. It had not been mentioned aloud since Rivendell, but it lived behind his silence. The heart of the mountain. The king's jewel. Lost when Smaug came, swallowed somewhere within the hoard, if it had not been broken or melted in the dragon's fury. Bilbo knew little of such things. Yet he felt them. Not through command, but through presence. On the fifth day, he was summoned. By Thorin, alone. They stood near the threshold, where the path bent upward and the wind came thin and sharp. Thorin looked over the valley and then turned to him, his eyes steady, but not kind. There is only one of you who can go. He did not say what had to be done. He did not need to. Behind the door, beneath stone and ash and time, the dragon still breathed. And someone would have to face what remained of him, woken or not. To find the keyhole, they needed Durin's day. But to know if the dragon waited, to see if a path lay to the treasure, and to recover the jewel, for that, they needed someone small, someone quiet, someone unseen. They needed the burglar. Bilbo Baggins, of Bag End, of no royal house nor mighty weapon, nodded once. And night returned. Far below, Dale slept in silent brokenness. And above, behind stone and sealed fear, an ancient fire stirred. Durin's day came at last. It arrived with little heraldry, no blaze in the sky, no trumpet note in the wind. Only a faint hush in the air, as though the mountain itself had drawn a breath it had waited an age to release. The crescent moon, caught high in a cold pale sky, faded into view as the sun drew low across the western shoulder of the vale. Shadows stretched from stone to stone, and the company stood in stillness, watching the light edge westward. Bilbo stood with them, silent, unsure if the cracked hands clutched behind his back trembled from cold or fear. Then, as if by some breathless calculation, a single beam of sunlight struck the wall above. It passed like a blade across the stone, scarcely visible at first, but brightening until it caught upon the bare face of the rock beside the hidden door. A soft glint followed. Then a flash. A moment later, a circle of gold glimmered from beneath a slab of old moss, and in its center, a keyhole appeared, simple and stubborn, as if waiting this whole time to be seen. Thorin stepped forward, his hand already holding the key that had passed from Thrain to Gandalf, now given into his rule. Without a word, he placed it into the lock, turned it, and the stone parted. It did not swing open, nor creak or groan like a wooden gate. It simply shifted in silence, turning invisibly on hidden hinges, until an opening stood before them, tall, narrow, and black. Cool air swept out from the depths of the mountain. No light came from within. It was not empty air. It was old, undisturbed. The company looked to Bilbo. They did not speak. Even Thorin, whose burden was heaviest, did not offer order or reassurance. He acknowledged the hobbit with a single nod, and Bilbo, swallowing down what words he might have said, stepped into the dark. The passage bent downward, narrow, sloped, and without ornament. No torch was taken. He carried only Sting in one hand and the ring in his pocket. He wore it now, not immediately, but when the silence grew too still and the darkness too thick. The ring pulsed cold as it touched his skin. He did not vanish from himself, only from the world. Even shrouded in invisibility, the slow descent felt like walking into something that had long since ceased to remember light. The tunnel widened after a time. It opened into great galleries, silent as tombs but vast beyond imagination. Bilbo moved between broken pillars, past statues cast down in ruin. Doors lay twisted from their hinges, and murals had faded into grey dust upon the walls. He traversed a once-living city turned sepulchre, its air dry, metallic, its echoes shallow despite the vastness around him. Stairs descended further still, and when he passed them, a pale red glimmer began to touch the edges of the path. And then he saw it. The hoard of Erebor. Coins beyond counting, mounded and scattered, a sea of gold that swallowed light and sound. Jewels in great cups. Army racks taller than towers, their weapons dulled by sleep but unbroken. Orbs of emerald and tourmaline the size of closed fists. Candelabra spun with silver and globes of mithril chained with lapis. It was not wealth. It was something else. Not beauty. Not possession. It was raw, unfiltered wanting, a mountain's worth of centuries, gathered by craft and mined by aching back, all now left to lie beneath dragon fire. And lying atop it like a terrible god enthroned upon ruin, the fire drake Smaug. He was vast beyond proportion, curled amidst coins and blades like a flame coiled around fear itself. His scales burned in places with dull embers, coked red and gold, as if his flesh had become the fire that once licked stone hall and throne. Smoke rose faintly from his nostrils. His tail, curled like a chainroad of bronze, twitched once but did not lift. He breathed, but his dreams, if he dreamt, were black and deep. Bilbo crept forward, breath caught like a leaf trapped in autumn breeze. Every footfall landed as soft as dust. His eye scanned the impossible hoard. And though Thror's map had not pointed it out, though no dwarf's tale marked its color or place, he saw it almost at once. The Arkenstone. It pulsed with a light not bright, but ancient, a star embalmed. Smooth, round, and heavy with meaning, it sat atop a rift of gold, as if it had risen naturally to rest above all. Bilbo approached it slowly, his heart staggering at how peaceful it looked amid the wreckage of nations. He pocketed it. Not by plan, and not with malice. It was an action without reason. A thought taken into motion before understood. He did not show it to the others. He did not know why. He turned to go. Behind him, somewhere deep in the dragon's breathing, a whisper stirred. Then movement. The hoard shifted. A breath changed, and Smaug opened his eye. No flame came at first, only that single golden eye, a slitted black and vast, like a door into death, scanning the dark. The dragon rose slowly, gold sliding off his back like coins sliding down hammered anvils. His head turned. His claws clicked against stone. "Thief," he said. No scream. No roar. Just the word. And the chase began. Bilbo fled as silently as he could, dodging beneath columns, diving behind broken coin mounds. Smaug's tail lashed. Where it struck, the floor broke. Where his wings unfolded, the wind itself fled. Fire came, bright, sudden, and shaped like speech unspoken, yet Bilbo dodged again and again, led by fear so pure it gave him clarity. He kept the ring on. Smaug could not see him, but he could smell. They exchanged words. The dragon taunted the unseen voice, tested him, laughed from a throat lined with cinder, called him barrel rider and filcher of smoke. Smaug guessed at truth and spoke of Lake Town, of men who once traded but still held no allegiance, of fire that could end them from a single wing beat. His pride was deeper than his hoard, and his rage older than steel. But Bilbo saw something else. A patch on the left side of his chest, bare, cracked, where a scale was missing. He fled not with courage, but with message. He returned, wild-eyed and panting, to the company beyond the door. He told them of Smaug's fury, of his size, his greed, his ruin. But most importantly, he told Bard. For the dragon had gone. Smaug, enraged, left Erebor like a flame uncloaked, bursting from the southern gate, screeching toward the lake. The sky above Lake Town split apart in color. The dragon came not as a beast but as vengeance embodied. The bells rang once, then burned. Arrows flew. Some struck true, but fell. Fire swept over roofs. The city burned on the water. And in the tower, with his last hope, Bard narked the black arrow. Forged of dwarven make, passed down from his father's line. Drawn from the great ashwood bow without cry or song. Guided by the thrush that had flown from mountain to man, moved by memory and message. It struck. Beneath the ribs, into the bare place. And Smaug fell. The golden shadow upon the sky tore like tapestry in flame. And with his death, the grief of fire fell silent. But with it came a new noise. The sound of greed rising from stone and ash. A silence that smelled not of soot, but of kingship. When the mountain ceased trembling and the stones no longer echoed with the last breath of the dragon, a silence settled over Erebor that had not been heard in generations. It was not the quiet of peace, nor of mourning, but the profound stillness that follows in the wake of something absolute. Even the air seemed to listen now. The ash within it had not yet settled, and the metallic taste of old fire remained on every surface, but Smaug was gone. No shadow swept the sky. No heat glowed behind the broken gate. What remained was the hoard, and the rising question of who would claim it. The company stood at the edge of the great chamber where once Bilbo had crept alone, where now all saw with their own eyes the sheer scale of wealth their forefathers had left behind. Chests toppled under their own fullness. Gemstones sprawled like river stones along golden streams. Every wall reflected pale gleams in crimson patterns where firelight might once have danced, and at the center of it all still wound the slowly cooling impressions left where the dragon had lain, like the coiled root of a burned tree. Thorin did not speak upon entering. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning not the shape of the hall, but something deeper, measuring, hunting. His boots crunched coins into dust beneath their heels, yet he walked as though he heard only memory beneath him. While the company paused at the sight, overcome by disbelief, reverence, or caution, Thorin alone appeared untouched by awe. In him, something had changed. With the dragon gone, what remained before him was not ruins or relics, it was entitlement. Not just to gold, but to identity. He moved with purpose toward the armory, where iron-forged relics leaned like weary veterans against the stone. He brushed aside their dust, uncovered plates engraved in the old tongue, weapons not wielded in a century of sleep. He took for himself a coat of hardened steel inlaid with mail fine as silk and crowned his brow with a helm cut deep with dwarvish runes. A red sapphire gleamed in the center of its crest. In that armor, he did not look like the same dwarf who had departed from Bag End. He did not speak in the same tones. His words, precise and measured before, now rang harder, formed in syllables that bore the ring of ceremony more than fellowship. He had reclaimed a throne the moment he saw it, even if none else had yet knelt. Balin watched him with quiet dread. Dwalin's hand lingered longer at his sword hilt than before. And Bilbo, more aware than most, said nothing, though he had felt the weight of the Arkenstone grow heavy in his vest pocket each passing hour. The Arkenstone, round, luminous, glowing softly from within like a frozen star, seemed warmer now. It pulsed faintly, as though aware that it had returned to the mountain. But Bilbo did not show it. Had not told of its taking. He had meant to. But Thorin's presence now discouraged even good intention. What had begun as a hasty decision in darkness had become something else entirely. To speak it now might have dire consequences. He felt the stone pressing through fabric into his ribs at night, reminding him of its silence and of his own. The other dwarfs began to gather their own armaments, not greedily, not yet, but with a reverence that bordered fear. Tools from their forebears, from the 7 houses, lay untouched for generations. They did not laugh. They did not sing. Gold in this place carried blood and memory in equal portions. Balin ventured question on the next morning. What course now, King Thorin? Thorin stood beside a column where the mountain opened into the old throne room, a massive hall carved in days when Durin's line had no need for defense. A high dais rose at the end, and upon it, the remnants of a shattered seat, scorched and broken, yet unmistakably a throne. We rebuild, Thorin replied. We reclaim what is ours. He spoke of restoring the kingdom, of reforging walls and redrawing the old boundaries. He began issuing commands, small at first, but strange. He ordered the search of the hoard for specific relics, an axe once borne by Thor's captain general, a belt crafted in the Iron Hills, a ruby ring once worn by his grandfather in the days before exile. Each item was found with labor. The dwarfs obeyed, though with slower steps. And then he named it again, the Arkenstone. He asked after it every day. And each day it was not found, his gaze darkened. It is mine by right, he would say, eyes alight with a hunger not befitting heirship. The heart of the mountain. It is the sign. The stone of kings. I will not rest until it is found. Bilbo kept his silence. Days passed. Then came news from the valley. Ravens arrived, as they had in the old days, winged messengers from the north. Their speech was not in the common tongue, but in the secret calls of dwarfs. Roak, son of Carrock, chief among them, came to rest atop a broken archway. His eyes had seen 100 winters, and his voice cracked like frost underfoot. Smaug is dead, he said. The company stood silent. Thorin did not ask how. He asked only what came next. Roak told of Lake Town's ruin, of the blackened water, of bells that melted mid-peal, and of homes turned to embers cast adrift. He told of Bard the bowman, a man out of Dale's line, who had stood in the tower and loosed the final arrow forged by dwarfs. He told of the funeral pyre lit upon the shore. And he told of what came after. The survivors now stirred. Bard had rallied both men and elves. Word had spread of the dragon's death, and with it the power left behind. An army now approached, not for war, but for redress, for aid, for honor, and for the ransom of fire undone. They carried no siege ladders. They bore no war song. But they marched nonetheless toward the mountain. Thorin listened. He made no gesture of welcome. Instead, he gave command to fortify the entrances. He ordered the outer gate to be sealed and the inner caches mined for whatever armor and weaponry yet remained. As stone cracked under pick and blade, Thorin sent a raven to Dane Ironfoot in the Iron Hills. "Come forth," his message read, "with all strength you can muster. Erebor is reclaimed. But others now come to take our inheritance by claim of woe. We must hold what is ours." Fili moved to speak. Thorin silenced him. "They come not as friends," Thorin said, "but as beggars. They come with open hand but want filled purses." Balin protested. "They come with grief, not gold lust." But Thorin would not hear it. "They did not stand with us when Smaug took everything. Now they come because the treasure lies unguarded. But they will find that it is not unguarded." Bilbo could listen no longer. That night, he left the hall without sound. The Arkenstone pressed against his skin, unchanged, unspoken, but no longer ignored. He walked the same halls where Smaug had once coiled, but now this dragon was of dwarven shape, and the fire kindled behind eyes. Thorin Oakenshield, son of Thrain, king under the mountain, sat awake long into nights no longer silent. Turning not over gold, but over the memory of a stone he yet could not find. A jewel that meant a crown, and perhaps, a war. By the time frost had returned to the morning stones ringing the lower slopes of the lonely mountain, the gates of Erebor had already been sealed. The great entrance, once blasted open by Smaug's fury, had been made whole again in form if not in grandeur. Stones, dragged and piled, fused with mortar and iron fittings, now formed a barrier more symbolic than strategic, defensive not in strength, but in statement. Thorin had not shut out only the cold and the wind. He had shut out the world. It was Roak who returned first, the old raven circling thrice above the gate towers before descending to the rock ledge at the foot of a broken statue. His report was brief. The army of the men of Lake Town, led by Bard and attended by messengers bearing the leaf-crested emblems of Thranduil, had reached the river's bend below Dale and taken camp in the shadow of that city's ruins. Their numbers were not vast. They bore no war machines. Lake Town's remnant was a battered force, survivors, not legions. Many were still hungry, clothed in coats scorched by dragon fire, with boots patched from the leavings of burned stores. But Bard had forged them into something resolute. Their lines were orderly, their weapons cleaned, their silence kept. They did not draw close to Erebor, but they did not move away. Thranduil came differently. The Elvenking's host emerged like silver branches grown along the river path. His archers moved in forest formation, light-footed and sharp-eyed. They sang no songs. Their weapons were beautiful in their deadliness. They camped apart from the men, separate fires, separate watch, but united in cause. They, too, had suffered losses. Greenwood the Great, once under Thranduil's dominion, had withered into Mirkwood, and the flames of Smaug had, in years prior, scorched trade and kin alike. The two leaders, Thranduil, lord of long memory and slow forgiveness, and Bard, man of few words and forward honor, met beneath a tattered old tree outside the southern gate of Dale, speaking not of conquest, but of rightful debt. Gandalf had returned by then, for news travelled far by flame and faster still through wizarding ways. When he came, no follower saw him arrive. One morning, he was simply there again, leaned on his staff beneath a burnt lintel, eyes turned toward Erebor with a gaze unreadable. He brought no counsel of war, only watchfulness. "He will not listen to me," he said, when Bard asked. "Not while the crown weighs more than the stone." Bard sent messengers bearing terms. His letter was plain. He did not name tribute or spoil, only asked that a portion of the hoard be granted to aid those who had suffered from the dragon's wrath, those whose homes had been lost, children left cold, and kin slain. He spoke not in demand, but in surety, as one who had loosed the final arrow. He even named himself as servant, not claimant, if it would ease pride. Thorin's reply was stone. Not a word of thanks, not a line of sympathy crossed his lips. He denied the debt, denied the dragon had ever been theirs to slay, and denied any right to gold not won by labor or blood. His messengers carried the dwarvish rune for no carved into a plate hammered from the outer wall, delivered not by accident, but by design. Bard met once again with Thranduil. "If the mountain will not speak, it must be made to listen," said the Elvenking. But Bard shook his head. "They are not tyrants yet." Then, from the east, came more tread. Dane Ironfoot, lord of the Iron Hills, kinsman to Thorin, and warrior of undoubted renown, marched with 500 dwarfs, each of them armored in linked iron mail and bearing mattocks, broad-bladed axes, and short bows. Their trail turned up dust for a league before it ever came into sight of the valley. Dane was not late. He had moved sideward through the hills at pace, and he did not come at Thorin's call lightly. He came for blood. Atop the walls of Erebor, Thorin watched with arms folded, helm crowned low over his brow. His smile was faint, edged with possessiveness. Balin stood beside him, murmuring once, "At what cost, cousin?" Thorin did not answer. The army of the Iron Hills made camp between the outer slopes of the valley and the banks of the river Ruin. The elves and men did not impede it, but neither did they welcome its presence. Between them stretched only the broken husk of Dale, its burned bones now scarred with footprints of 3 peoples bound by a silent tension. Inside the mountain, the mood was darker still. The dwarfs of Thorin's company spoke less. Gloin polished his axe twice a day. Dori mended a wound upon his arm without once looking up. Bomba ate in silence. Even Bofa's once constant songs lay dormant upon his lips. They watched Thorin change, but how do you name a change that lays not in action, but in absence? He no longer slept. He walked constantly, pacing the throne halls, hands running along wall edge and treasure mounds. He muttered to himself, spoke out loud in dwarvish fragments as if conferring with unseen advisors long dead. When he sat upon the throne, what was left of it, his fingers would knot and tighten on the edges of the seat as though afraid it might vanish again. And still, he asked after the Arkenstone. Bilbo kept it close. He did not touch it unnecessarily, nor gaze at its light. But the weight of it was no longer just a secret, it was rapidly becoming a burden. The stone had not cursed him, did not burn him, but each day Thorin's mood grew darker, and each day Bilbo's silence tightened like thread around the heart. When one night passed without food, Thorin refusing to share more stores, claiming siege demanded austerity, Bilbo slipped from the hall and climbed a winding path at the edge of the wall, creeping between sleeping guards. In his cloak wrapped tight, he crossed the stone chamber where once the dragon had coiled, stepped through a window hidden behind the balustrades, and climbed into the rubble above the mountain's shoulder. There, in the dim light of morning, he met Bard. No guards. No ceremony. The man had stood watch beneath the ledge for 2 nights, and Bilbo had learned his pattern. He offered the Arkenstone into Bard's hands. "I give it freely," he said. "He will never yield to you, but he values this more than gold. It might buy peace." Bard held it with care, as though it were not stone, but memory itself. With its glow reflecting in his eyes, he said only, "You are more than you were, burglar." Bilbo nodded. "I hope so." Then he left before light fully touched the wall. The next morning, Bard sent heralds once more, and this time they came not empty-handed. Wrapped in dyed cloth laid with care was the Arkenstone, born not as ransom, but as rightful bargaining tool. He offered it to Thorin, without deception. Thorin's face twisted. "This," he said slowly, lifting it with shaking hands, "is mine." Bard did not contradict him. "Then take it as part of your claim, return in kind to those who lost more than gold." But Thorin's voice changed. "You think to cheat me," he hissed. "You think to steal from beneath my own guard." He turned his fury inward, accused his companions of betrayal, called the mountain no longer a kingdom, but a keep under threat. When Bilbo stepped forward at last, saying nothing at first, only looking into the eyes of this king he had once known as a wanderer, Thorin stared in dawning certainty. "You," he whispered. Not in anger now, but disbelief. Gently, with no defense and no denial, Bilbo met his gaze. "I gave it, because it ought to be used." Thorin could not strike him. He only turned away. And that night, under iron-grey skies piled with omen, drums sounded from the east. Dane's host had moved. Battle would begin at sunrise. The cold winds broke at dawn. They came down swift that morning from the grey mountains, tearing across the plain before Erebor and lending to the day a chill that did not belong to early autumn. The low clouds gathered, strange and slow, hovering like a breath caught between sleep and battle. Flagless spears stood in 3 lines across the valley, elves in tight files beneath banners stitched with green and silver, men in their worn armor, less refined but proud, led at the fore by Bard, and dwarfs of the Iron Hills, massed west of the ruins, arrayed in heavy ranks of iron and bronze, their helms squared like forges brought to life. There were no war horns that morning. No songs. Only eyes, steady and unblinking, drawn toward the mountain. Within the sealed gates, Thorin paced. He wore the crown his grandfather once forged, now newly set in gold scratched but whole. The Arkenstone had been placed upon a cloth, held beside the throne by a guard whose face showed no understanding of what it meant to carry it. Thorin spoke little. To Dwalin, he gave brief instruction. To Balin, silence. To Bilbo, no words were spoken, not once, though the Hobbit stood quietly in the back, waiting. The final hour was upon them. Dane's forces began to advance. No command sounded. No challenge was called aloud. They marched without flourish, shields down, eyes narrowed beneath steel visors. Dust rose beneath their boots, and with each step, war came closer. The elves moved to meet it, not toward conquest, but against perceived aggression. Their archers strung bows. The men tightened their flanks. Bard, to the very last, held up a single hand, to delay, to stall, to plead for one final moment of reason. And into that moment came the shadow. The mountain trembled. Not from marching feet, but from beyond, the tremor of many steps, heavy and fast, sweeping forward from the hills to the north. At first, dust only. Then shapes. Then certainty. Goblins. Thousands. They came streaming down the slopes, not in orderly formation, but in a wave, black, rank, a horde carried on hunger and malice. From the wastes of Mount Gundabad and the deeper corners of the misty mountains they came, drawn by rumor first, then by vengeance. Their packs were led by Bolg, son of Azog, bearing the iron crown of his father and the cruel intent of his own forging. Not alone did he come, but with wargs snapping at his flanks, bats thick as smoke clouding the rear, and trolls armored in warp iron pushing battering staves ahead of them. The battlefield turned. Elves and men, dwarfs and archers, all turned, from the mountain to the rising plain roaring with war not of honor or treasure, but destruction. In that moment of converging fate, the horns were blown. Not by Thranduil nor Bard, not by Dane, but by the wild call of urgency. The sound splintered the cold air like the cracking of ice. Gandalf, from the central rise between the lines, raised his staff high, light flaring once, as if to draw breath across all of them at once. No longer three sides. Only two. Light against darkness. And so began the battle of the 5 armies. The first assault broke against the lower line of men and elves, who bore the impact of the goblins' arrival with shield and sovereign discipline. Dane led his warriors at once, charging not beside but through the line to meet the advance, his axe flashing in great arcs beneath the mountain wind. Arrows sang above them, elven fletching falling with precision, and behind the ranks of Bard, pikes rose to swallow the chaos that leapt at them screaming from the hills. Bolg thrust his pack into the heart of the defenders. Around him, his banner-bearers slashed forward, stamping symbols of bone upon the earth. He spoke no words. His commands were gestures. Rumor claimed he wielded not speech but blood. The company of Thorin remained within. At the gates of the mountain, the company had watched the field fragment into blood and snow. Smoke drifted now from the valley, and steel rhythm rang with no music, only pain. Thorin sat long beside the Arkenstone, its light dimmed by the shadow behind his eyes. The crown on his brow seemed heavier than the helm he once wore. Around him the others stood uncertain, Fili and Kili with weapons gripped but unused. Not cowardice. Not fear. Paralysis of a different kind. To march into battle meant turning from gold. And Thorin, even now, hesitated. Bilbo stepped forward. "You said you would not hide behind stone," he said, voice almost lost to the murmurs of distant death. Thorin looked at him, not as king to subject, nor even captain to thief, but as something else. Recognition flickered. Pain. Then came the shadow of shame. He stood. He ordered the gate opened. And they marched. Through the broken stone, down the slope they came. 12 dwarfs behind a king, stomping beside the dwarfs they had known in exile. To the blast of horn, the cry of steel, they ran not to command the battle, but to reforge what had been forgotten, the honor of Durin's folk, the oath that bound them to the land rather than the treasure. They struck the center of the line with the precision of forge-trained hands. Thorin moved through warriors like a forge hammer through soft iron, and his kin beside him carved quick paths. Keely and Philly, youngest and proudest, passed ahead to seek the banner of Bolg, believing that if the head was cut, the body would collapse. They did not reach it. In a shield ring pressed just beyond the slope, Bolg turned, recognizing them, not as warriors, but as symbols, and slew them both. Philly first, caught from behind by a curved talon of iron. Keely made it to him, fell with him, wordless at the last. Bilbo did not see it. He had moved higher, where archers flanked the right, casting stones and broken shafts when arrows failed. From that height he watched the tide bend, saw the elves scatter and collapse before the troll guard of Bolg, crushing beasts driven by whips of spike and hate. He saw Gandalf fall once, then rise again, bleeding, staff broken but not yet lost. Then came the cry of eagles. Not of war horns, but of wings. Broad shadows swept from the sky, from the west and north, eagles vast and fierce, led by Gwaihir and his kin. They fell not like birds, but like mountain storms. Claws drove through trolls and scattered wolves like leaves. Screams and weather merged. Bilbo turned back to signal the mountain and saw Thorin alone on the high flank, battling past the corpses of his kin. His helm was gone. Blood streaked his mail. He moved not like a king now, but like a forge beast, unthinking, unyielding. He reached Bolg's line as the sky cracked above. He faced the Orc Lord alone. No one came to him in time. Their battle was brief and brutal. Bolg, heavy and flame-scarred, bore armor that pushed blows aside. Thorin drove inside the reach, swinging sword and shield, breaking spear and claw, but Bolg struck him low, pierced his side with iron teeth. And then the Mountain King, son of Thrain, rose one final time, and drove his sword not at the chest, but through the neck, beneath the plates. Bolg fell. But so did Thorin. When the battle ended, few stood. The field was chaos subdued. Smoke drifted. Dead lay in circles where once formations had pressed inward. Elves searched for arrows. Men buried their kin. Dwarves carried, not arms, but bodies. Bilbo found him near the river, beneath a broken spear standard, where Gandalf now sat quiet. Thorin breathed, but faintly. When Bilbo knelt beside him, the king looked up. "Forgive me," he said. "I was wrong." Bilbo shook his head, but said nothing. "There is more in you, Master Baggins, than any of us could see. If more of us valued home over hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world." Thorin's eyes clouded then, and his voice fell silent. He died beneath a sky not stormed, but quiet once more. Balin wept openly. Dwalin clenched his jaw so tightly it cracked. The stone crown was taken from Thorin's brow and placed beside his hand. The mountain did not protest. No fire came. No tremor. Only ravens circled quietly above, black wings against pale sky. And in the halls of Erebor, the Arkenstone no longer hummed. Its light had dimmed. The days after the battle did not pass quickly, but they passed without further sound of war. Mourners stitched the valley in lines of quiet work. Fires were kindled in places not for warmth but for burning, pyres raised where sword fell beside shield and hand no longer grasped for gold. The eastern slope of Erebor became a place of names unspoken, not by neglect, but by reverence. And in the deep chambers of the mountain, 3 tombs were carved. Thorin Oakenshield lay first, crowned in death as never fully in life. His sword Allcrist, once lost and found again by the elves, was placed upon his breast. The blade glowed faint in the presence of orcs, and there it would lie forever, silent warning upon the stone. Beside him were laid his nephews, Fili and Kili, heirs of his sister's line, whose sacrifice left their house empty but not diminished in memory. The Arkenstone was returned to his breast, placed not by Bilbo, who had offered it up for peace, but by Dane, who said nothing and gave no judgment. The gem held no more pride, no more command. It simply shone, quiet, constant, like the hope that had been placed upon it for too long. Dane, Lord of the Iron Hills, was made king thereafter. He accepted the burden without flourish. There were no songs at the moment of his enthronement, no banners lifted high. Erebor had been reclaimed, but not in triumph. Its halls were again filled with dwarfs, those returned from exile, those who had come for war and chose instead to stay for kin. The commerce resumed. The forges were lit in memory more than greed, and coins began again to flow. But something had changed beyond the stones. Bilbo did not stay long. He had walked the length of the mountain, back through the chamber where Smaug once lay, back through the treasure-smoothed floors and the galleries where memory clung to unburned banners. He had seen enough to last a lifetime, and more. The goal did not move him. It lay too quiet for his heart, and the silence of Thorin's last words lived longer in his bones than any marvel could stir. He packed simply, only what he had brought and what he had earned, and even then, he left behind more than he took. Gandalf walked with him part of the way. The wilds between Erebor and the western lands had quieted for a time. Orcs scattered or slain. Trolls hiding if not routed. The very wind moved slower, as though the mountain's disturbance had shaken something back into its slumber. They passed again through Dale, where Bard had begun rebuilding stone by stone. The people welcomed them without pomp. Men hardened by loss do not forget small kindnesses. Bard gifted Bilbo a necklace of silver and pearl, not as treasure, but in thanks. And though Bilbo tried to refuse it, as he had done with other gifts, it was pressed upon him with a firm smile, accompanied by one line, "You remembered mercy." From there it was west again, along rivers turned to autumn, and hills yellowed at the edges. The land healed more slowly than wounds. The forest, too, recovered. Mirkwood's border remained untamed, but the shadow over it had thinned. Thranduil returned to his realm, his halls no less cold, but his judgment changed by what he had seen. "There is courage in strange places," he said once to Gandalf, and then spoke no more of hobbits. Beorn was visited last. There, the great skin-changer greeted them with none of the suspicion he had given before. In his house, they were welcomed again, and rest came at last without the push of urgency. He asked no questions of dragons. He understood speeches without need for words. And when Bilbo departed the final morning, Beorn gave him a small bundle of honeycake, wrapped in a hide cloth that bore the smell of hearth smoke and clean wilderness, and a gentle bow. The misty mountains were crossed again under a sky different than the one they remembered. Where once lightning cracked and goblins screamed below, there was only wind now. Soft wind, clear and biting. The peaks turned silver against the edge of morning light. Bilbo looked down once, knew where he had fallen. There were no footprints to mark that place. The earth had closed behind him, but what he had taken from those dark paths would live longer than the stone. When Rivendell came into view again, it came not as marvel, but as memory. The last homely house still stood draped in twilight trees, and Elrond was unchanged, his voice as calm and distant as it had been before all war, before all sorrow. Bilbo heard the elven songs again, though he understood them better now. There were verses of choice, of roads walked alone, of burdens quietly carried. He did not ask for an interpretation. Even in Rivendell, the ring whispered. He had not used it since the mountain. Would not use it again for many years. But it remained, tucked away, quiet, yet present. When Gandalf left him not far beyond the borders of the Shire, parting with a nod and a farewell low-spoken, Bilbo watched the wizard disappear down the road, his staff tapping in slow rhythm until the sound became the memory of steps once heard across all the miles they had walked. Then he came home. Bag End stood unchanged, yet changed. The grass grew taller. Carvings of ivy curled tighter around his round green door. Mail had piled up in bundles. But more than that, the door had been sold, his belongings auctioned, his house declared vacant, his possessions scattered across hobbit holes and garden paths. Inside, storage chests now stood empty. His pantry found new ownership. His books had gathered dust in stacks recalled only faintly. They did not believe it was him. First his cousins, then his neighbors. Some gawked. Some frowned. Others accused him of fraud. He arrived dressed in simple travel gear, without pomp, without proof, only a single small pack and a voice tired of defense. He had been declared dead. Thorin's share, the gold, the portion he offered freely, Bilbo refused. Not entirely, but mostly. He kept enough for quiet living, small comforts, repairs to Bag End, the restoration of his library, and the building of an oak bench beneath the old tree where he'd first spoken with Gandalf. The rest, he let pass. He settled again into his armchair, dusted off the last of his maps, and placed the faded contract from Thorin's company into his writing box, folded, unread, but never thrown away. It was not spoken of, not often. To other hobbits, he became odd, unpredictable, changed. They whispered of the trolls, of dragons, of treasure untouched. They did not ask about spiderwebs or night marches through ancient forest. They did not know the name Smaug beyond rumor. They forgot, as hobbits do. But Bilbo did not. He dreamed sometimes of fire, of stone halls lit with gold, and of a jewel gleaming behind a king's dying breath. He lit his pipe each evening as the wind came down from the north and thought of ravens, of horns, of the road that wound quietly beneath his own garden gate and disappeared where trees wore names he no longer feared. And in his pocket, wrapped in cloth, the ring lay sleeping. Quiet, for now. Its true story had not begun. But a hobbit had walked into the depth of the world and returned. And his feet knew the shape of the road forever after.